Tonight, we're going to explore a bridge. Not just any bridge, but perhaps the most important crossing in all of Westeros, a structure that has shaped the fate of kingdoms and the lives of millions. We'll journey to the Twins, that remarkable fortress astride the green fork of the Trident, and discover the family who built it, who profited from it, who were defined by it. House Frey. A name that carries weight in Westerosi history, though not always the kind of weight its members might have wished for. This isn't going to be a tale of dragons or ancient magic, though those elements touch the story at its edges. Instead, we'll move slowly and carefully through 600 years of patient accumulation, of strategic marriages and careful alliances, of wealth gained and respect withheld, of ambition that built something remarkable and choices that cast long shadows. We'll examine what it means to be powerful yet looked down upon, wealthy yet excluded, essential yet dismissed. If you enjoy these calm explorations of the lesser-told corners of Westerosi history, a like and subscribe really helps others find their way here. And to those already part of this community, thank you. Your presence makes these journeys more meaningful. So settle in now, let your shoulders drop away from your ears, take a slow breath, and feel it move through you. Tonight there are only voices from the past, the steady flow of a river, and the quiet space you've made for yourself. The world can wait. For now, there is only the story of a bridge, a family, and the long game of power. Before we can understand House Frey, before we can grasp what they became and why their choices mattered so much to the fate of Westeros, we need to understand the place that made them. Geography, after all, is often destiny, and nowhere in the Seven Kingdoms is this more true than at the crossing of the Green Fork. So let's begin not with people, but with the land itself, with the river that carved out both opportunity and obligation. The Green Fork of the Trident is one of three great branches that give that river system its name. The Blue Fork and the Red Fork are the others, and where these three rivers converge, you find some of the richest, most contested land in all of Westeros, the Riverlands, a region blessed with fertile soil and abundant water, cursed by the fact that it sits at the crossroads of too many kingdoms, too many ambitions. Throughout history, the Riverlands have been invaded, occupied, fought over, their people caught in the endless wars between the north and south, east and west. The Green Fork is the northernmost of these branches, and it runs deep and wide and cold, fed by countless smaller streams flowing down from the hills and high places. In spring, when the snows melt, it swells beyond its banks, flooding the low meadows, turning roads to mud. In summer, it runs strong but more predictable, its waters clear enough to see the stones on the bottom in the shallows, though the centre channel remains dark and deep. In autumn, it begins to rise again with the rains, and in winter, depending on how far south you are, it might freeze along its edges, though the current usually keeps the centre flowing. At one particular point, roughly halfway between the northern mountains and where the Green Fork joins its sisters, the river presents a problem. It's too wide to wade, too deep to ford reliably, too swift to swim without significant risk of being swept away. The banks on either side are relatively firm, rising slightly above the floodplain, but the river itself is a barrier, an absolute barrier, one that has shaped human movement and settlement for thousands of years. Before there was a bridge, there were only difficult choices. You could travel many miles east to find a narrower crossing, adding days to any journey, and passing through lands that might be hostile or at least unwelcoming. You could travel west, but that took you further from the main roads, further into less settled country where bandits might be more of a concern than the inconvenience of the detour. Or you could attempt to cross here, at this wide point, using a ferry if one was available, hoping the ferryman was honest, hoping the weather held, hoping your horse wouldn't panic in the boat. Ferries had operated at this crossing for centuries, probably for millennia. Some ferryman would establish himself on one bank or the other, would build a boat, or more likely a series of boats, and would charge travellers for passage. It was a living, sometimes a good one, though dangerous. Ferryboats capsized. People drowned. Horses kicked holes in hulls. Spring floods swept boats away. It was uncertain, both for the ferryman and for travellers, but it was the best option available for a very long time. The strategic importance of this crossing point cannot be overstated. Anyone wanting to move a significant force between the north and the south, anyone wanting to move goods in bulk, anyone conducting major trade or troop movements, had to deal with this river. During times of war, control of the crossing meant control of movement, the ability to permit your allies to pass while denying your enemies. During times of peace, control of the crossing meant wealth, the ability to collect fees from the endless stream of travellers, merchants, messengers, pilgrims, all the human traffic that flows along the major routes of Westeros. The land itself around the crossing is good riverlands country, rich soil, capable of supporting prosperous farms, productive orchards, healthy livestock. It's not the spectacular fertility of the Reach, but it's better than most places, certainly better than the thin, cold soil of the north or the rocky ground of the Vale. This was land worth having, land that could support a population, land that could feed armies or generate tax revenue. But the real value wasn't in the fields. It was in the crossing, in that simple geographic fact that here the river must be crossed, and whoever controlled the crossing controlled something precious. For most of Westerosi history, this crossing was just one point along a border, one problem among many for whatever power controlled the riverlands at any given time. The riverlands have been conquered and reconquered more than any other region. The Ironborn held them for a time, ruling from Harrenhal with an iron fist. The Storm Kings claimed them. The various riverland houses fought among themselves for dominance. Control shifted, borders changed, and through it all, the Green Fork kept flowing, kept presenting the same problem, kept offering the same opportunity. The idea of building a bridge must have occurred to many people over many generations. Why not create a permanent crossing, a structure that would eliminate the uncertainty and danger of ferries? But there were enormous obstacles to such a project. The engineering challenge alone was formidable. The Green Fork at this point is nearly 1,000 feet wide, perhaps more when swollen with spring melt. Building a bridge of that span with medieval technology required not just ambition, but expertise, resources, time, and a kind of sustained commitment that's hard to maintain over the decades such a project would require. There was also the question of who would build it and why. A bridge is enormously expensive. The materials alone, the timber for false work, the stone for pilings and arches, the iron for reinforcement, the tools, the labour, all of it required wealth on a scale that few individuals could command. And even if someone could afford to build it, why would they? The Riverland lords had castles to maintain, armies to equip, their own ambitions to fund. Building a bridge across the Green Fork would benefit everyone who used it, but the cost would fall on whoever built it. It was what we might call a collective action problem, where the benefits are distributed but the costs are concentrated. And yet, the opportunity remained, glittering like gold in the sun. Anyone who could build a bridge and control access to it could charge tolls. Every person who crossed, every horse, every wagon, every head of cattle or sheep being driven to market, all could be taxed. The revenue from such an enterprise, if managed properly, could be staggering. Not immediate, of course. You'd have to pay off the initial investment first, and that would take years, probably decades. But over the long term, over generations, the wealth that would flow from controlling the crossing could transform a minor house into a major power. This is where our story truly begins, in this gap between problem and solution, between the river that needed crossing and the bridge that didn't yet exist. Somewhere around 600 years before the War of the Five Kings, around the time when the Targaryen dynasty was still just beginning to find its footing in Westeros, a man looked at this river and saw not an obstacle, but an opportunity. We don't know his name for certain. The histories call him simply the first Lord Frey, or sometimes just the founder. But whoever he possessed something rare. He possessed vision, the ability to imagine something that didn't exist, and the will to bring it into being. This man, this founder, was by most accounts not a great lord. House Frey wasn't ancient or particularly distinguished. They claimed some connection to the first men, as most Riverland houses did, but they weren't the Blackwoods or the Brackens with their thousands of years of history. They weren't the Tullys or the Mallisters or any of the prominent families. They were perhaps wealthy enough to be noticed, but not so wealthy or well-connected that they wielded real political power. Middle tier, we might say, if we're being generous. Unremarkable, if we're being honest. But this founder, he looked at the Green Fork and he made a calculation. He assessed the costs, the time, the materials, the labour. He estimated the traffic that would use a bridge if one existed. He projected revenue from tolls over years and decades, and he decided it could work. More than that, he decided it would work, that this was how an unremarkable house could become remarkable, how accumulated wealth could be transformed into lasting power. The decision to build the bridge wasn't made lightly, and it wasn't made alone. The founder would have needed approval from his liege lord, whoever held power in the Riverlands at that time. He would have needed to negotiate rights, to establish legal precedent for charging tolls, to secure his family's claim to both the land and the revenue. These negotiations alone probably took years. Lords are jealous of their prerogatives, suspicious of change, reluctant to allow a vassal to become too wealthy or too independent. The founder must have been persuasive, must have offered something in return, perhaps a share of the toll revenue, perhaps promises of military support. Perhaps simply the argument that a bridge would benefit everyone and cost the liege lord nothing. Once permission was secured, the real work began. Engineers had to be found, probably brought in from far away, from the great cities where such expertise existed. Plans had to be drawn, calculations made about where to sink the pilings, how deep, how to account for the current and the seasonal variations in the river's depth. Quarries had to be opened or contracts made with existing quarries. Forests had to be cleared for timber. Craftsmen had to be hired. Stonemasons, carpenters, blacksmiths, labourers by the hundred. The construction itself must have taken decades. You can't rush a project of this magnitude. Each piling had to be sunk deep into the riverbed, driven down until it hit bedrock, or was wedged firmly enough to support the weight of stone arches. Cofferdams had to be built to keep the river out while work proceeded. Stone had to be shaped precisely, fitted together without mortar in some places, with carefully mixed mortar in others. The arches had to be constructed with temporary wooden scaffolding. Each stone placed exactly right, so that when the scaffolding was removed, the arch would hold, would distribute the weight properly, would stand against the river's current and the ice of winter, and the weight of countless travellers for centuries to come. And all of this had to be paid for. Month after month, year after year, the costs mounted. Workers had to be fed and housed. Materials had to be purchased and transported. Accidents happened, setbacks occurred, floods damaged partially completed work, and everything had to be repaired or rebuilt. The founder's wealth, whatever it had been, must have been poured entirely into this project. He must have borrowed, must have mortgaged lands, must have made deals and promises and commitments that bound not just himself but his children and grandchildren. Perhaps he didn't live to see it completed. That's often the way with great projects. The founder might have died with the bridge half built, leaving his son or grandson to continue the work, to honour the commitment, to see the vision through to completion. Or perhaps he lived long enough to walk across the finished structure, to stand at its centre and look down at the green fork flowing beneath, to know that he had accomplished something that would outlast him by centuries. We don't know. The histories don't record those personal details, those human moments. They record only that the bridge was built, that it was completed, that it stood firm and strong across the green fork. And with the completion of the bridge, House Frey's transformation began. the toll started coming in, first as a trickle, then as a steady stream. Every traveller who chose this route instead of the long detour, every merchant who saved days off their journey, every lord moving troops quickly between north and south, all of them paid. The amounts were individually modest, carefully calculated not to be so high as to drive traffic away, but high enough to generate significant revenue when multiplied by the thousands of crossings that occurred each year. The wealth accumulated slowly at first, used to pay off the debts incurred during construction, to repair and maintain the bridge itself, to support the household and the growing retinue that any successful house required. But over time, over generations, the surplus grew. The Freys built castles on each bank of the river, mirror images of each other, connected by the bridge that had made them wealthy. These fortresses, which would come to be called simply the Twins, were both defensive structures and symbols, a statement to all who passed that this crossing belonged to House Frey, that their wealth and power were literally built into the landscape. The engineering of the Twins was clever, perhaps even brilliant. By building a castle on each side of the river, connected by the bridge, the Freys created a defensible position unlike any other in Westeros. To force the crossing, an enemy would have to take not one castle but two, separated by 1,000 feet of river. Artillery on one side could support the other. Troops could move between them quickly using the bridge. The bridge itself could be damaged or destroyed if necessary to prevent an enemy crossing, though this was always a last resort, as the bridge was the source of Frey wealth, and destroying it would be like burning your own treasury. The toll system became increasingly sophisticated over the generations. Different rates for different types of traffic, nobles paying more than commoners but receiving better treatment, merchants negotiating bulk rates for regular crossings, military forces paying substantial sums to move armies across quickly. The Freys kept meticulous records, employed toll collectors and accountants, developed a bureaucracy to manage what had become a complex and lucrative enterprise. And through all of this, through the centuries of accumulation and growth, the Freys remained what they had always been: vassals. The bridge made them wealthy, wealthier than many of the great houses they owed fealty to. The Twins made them powerful, capable of fielding armies that rivaled those of their supposed superiors. But it didn't make them respected, and it didn't change their fundamental position in the feudal hierarchy of Westeros. They were Riverland lords, sworn to whoever ruled the Riverlands, and that meant they bowed to others who often had less wealth, but more ancient names, more distinguished lineages, more of that ineffable quality called honour. This gap between wealth and status, between power and respect, would become the defining tension of House Frey's existence. They had built something remarkable, something that demonstrated vision and capability and sheer determined will. They had transformed a geographic obstacle into a source of enduring wealth and power. They had done everything right, by the logic of economics and strategy. And yet they would never quite be accepted, never quite be welcomed into the higher circles, never quite escape the fundamental fact that they were new money in a world that valued old blood above all else. The bridge had lifted them up, but it couldn't change who they were, or more importantly, how others saw them. The bridge changed everything for House Frey, but change, real fundamental change in the feudal world of Westeros, happened slowly, across generations rather than within a single lifetime. The founder and his immediate descendants understood this. They were playing a long game, building not just a structure of stone and timber, but a dynasty, a legacy that would compound over centuries like interest on a carefully invested fortune. Let's explore how this worked, how a house went from unremarkable to unavoidable through patient strategy and a kind of ruthless pragmatism that would become their defining characteristic. The early Frey lords, those who came in the first century or two after the bridge's completion, faced a particular challenge. They had wealth, yes, more wealth than they'd ever imagined, flowing in steadily from the tolls. They had a strategic position that made them militarily significant, but they lacked the one thing that mattered most in the aristocratic society of Westeros: legitimacy in the eyes of their peers. They were regarded as toll collectors, as merchants in all but name, as people who made their money from traffic rather than from the traditional sources of noble wealth like land and agriculture and conquest. This disdain wasn't entirely unfair from the perspective of the older houses. The feudal system of Westeros, like feudal systems throughout history, was built on a particular understanding of how power should work. Lords were supposed to protect their people, to lead them in war, to dispense justice, to embody certain virtues like courage and honour and loyalty. In return, they received fealty and taxes and military service. It was a reciprocal relationship, or at least it was supposed to be, grounded in mutual obligation and ancient custom. The Freys, by contrast, simply collected money from people passing through their territory. They didn't protect those travellers, not really. They didn't govern them or judge them or lead them. They just charged them for the privilege of using a bridge. It was transactional rather than feudal, commercial rather than martial. And in a society that looked down on merchants and commerce as fundamentally beneath the dignity of true nobility, this was a mark against them that no amount of wealth could entirely erase. The early Frey lords dealt with this problem in the way that ambitious families have always dealt with it, through marriage. Marriage in the feudal world is politics by other means, a way of creating alliances, of binding houses together through blood and obligation. A well-chosen marriage can elevate a family's status, can bring legitimacy and connections that gold alone cannot purchase. And so, the Freys married, deliberately and strategically, generation after generation. Their strategy was patient and systematic. They didn't aim too high at first, didn't try to marry into the very greatest houses. Such attempts would have been rebuffed, would have only highlighted their inferior status. Instead, they married into solid, respectable Riverland families. Second sons of good houses married Frey daughters who brought substantial dowries. Frey sons married into families that were perhaps less wealthy but more established, trading gold for genealogy, money for respectability. Each generation they aimed slightly higher. A Frey daughter might marry a minor lord in one generation, and her granddaughter might marry that lord's grandson, now the head of a more prominent house. A Frey son might marry into a cadet branch of a great house, and his son might marry closer to the main line. It was patient work, the kind of multi-generational strategy that requires discipline and a willingness to think beyond one's own lifetime, to make investments that your grandchildren will reap the benefits of. The Freys also understood the importance of numbers. They married often and had many children, far more than most noble houses. This wasn't accidental. More children meant more marriage alliances, more connections spread across the Riverlands and beyond. It meant redundancy in the line of succession, insurance against the accidents and diseases that could end a noble house. It meant a larger extended family that could be deployed in various positions of influence and authority. This multiplication of Freys began early but accelerated over time. By the third or fourth generation after the bridge's completion, there were already dozens of Freys scattered across the Riverlands, married into various houses, serving as knights and stewards and commanders. By the time we reached the era of the main story, 600 years after the founder, there would be literally hundreds of Freys. A sprawling family tree so complex that even the Freys themselves sometimes had trouble keeping track of all their relations. The wealth from the tolls made this multiplication possible. Children are expensive to raise, especially noble children who must be educated, trained in arms, dressed appropriately, dowered or provided with inheritances. A typical noble house might have 2 or 3 children who survived to adulthood, and that was considered a blessing, a sign of the Seven's favour. The Freys regularly had 6, 8, 10 or more surviving children per generation, and they could afford to support all of them because the bridge kept generating revenue, steady and reliable year after year. This wealth also allowed the Freys to build beyond just the twins themselves. They acquired lands in the surrounding territory, good farmland that could support a large population. They built additional fortifications, smaller keeps and towers that extended their control over the region around the crossing. They invested in mills and markets, in orchards and fisheries, diversifying their revenue sources while always keeping the bridge tolls as their foundation. Their military strength grew proportionally. With wealth and land and a large family, the Freys could maintain a substantial standing force and call up even more men in times of war. By the time of the War of the Five Kings, House Frey would be able to field nearly 4,000 men, making them one of the strongest military powers in the Riverlands, stronger in some ways than their liege lords, the Tullys of Riverrun. This military capability was essential to their strategy. It ensured that other houses had to take them seriously, had to treat them with at least outward respect, even if that respect was grudging. But military power alone doesn't create genuine acceptance in aristocratic society. The Freys were strong, yes, and wealthy, certainly, but they remained somehow apart, somehow not quite legitimate in the eyes of the older families. This was partly about their relatively recent rise, the fact that 600 years is not very long in a society that measures lineages in thousands of years. The Starks had been kings in the north for 8,000 years. Or so they claimed. The Lannisters traced their line back to Lann the Clever in the Age of Heroes. Even the Tullys, who were actually younger as great lords than the Freys were as bridgekeepers, had a mystique about them that the Freys lacked. It was also about the nature of their wealth and power. The bridge, that remarkable achievement, that testament to vision and engineering and sustained effort, was also a kind of mark against them. It was too commercial. Too obviously about money. True nobility, in the eyes of Westeros's aristocracy, didn't count coins. True nobility took what was theirs by right of conquest or ancient grant, ruled because they were born to rule, led because leadership was in their blood. The Freys charged fees, they negotiated rates, they kept accounts. It was all somehow beneath the dignity that other houses claimed for themselves, even when those houses were poorer and weaker. The Freys, for their part, developed their own distinct culture in response to this exclusion. They became intensely practical, focused on results rather than reputation, on power rather than prestige. They learned early that honour wouldn't feed you, that ancient lineage wouldn't protect you in war, that the respect of other nobles was a pleasant thing to have but not essential to survival and success. What mattered was the bridge, the tolls, the gold that kept flowing in, the soldiers you could pay, the alliances you could buy. This pragmatism became encoded in their house culture, passed down from father to son, from mother to daughter. A Frey learned to calculate, to assess costs and benefits, to make deals and stick to them when it was advantageous, and break them when the price was right. They learned to resent the airs that poorer but more prestigious houses put on, to see through the pretense of honour to the grubby reality of self-interest that motivated everyone. Whether they admitted it or not, they also learned to be patient, to wait for their moment. The Freys understood that their house's trajectory was upward, that each generation they grew wealthier, more connected, more essential to the functioning of the Riverlands. Time was on their side. The older houses might look down on them now, but the Freys would outlast them, would be there when those ancient lines failed and needed Frey gold to sustain themselves, would be waiting when political circumstances changed and old hierarchies broke down. There's something almost admirable about this patience, this willingness to accept temporary humiliation in service of long-term gain. The early Freys endured snubs and insults that must have stung, must have burned in the memories of men who knew they were wealthier and stronger than those who looked down on them. They accepted their place as vassals to houses they could have crushed militarily. They played by rules that disadvantaged them. Rules written by and for the older aristocracy. And they did all of this because they understood that time and persistence would eventually give them what confrontation never could. The relationship with House Tully, their liege lords, was particularly complex and would become more so over the centuries. The Tullys had risen to prominence relatively recently themselves, elevated by the Targaryens after Aegon's conquest to rule the Riverlands. Before the conquest, the Riverlands had been a patchwork of competing powers, invaded repeatedly by the Iron Islands and the Stormlands, never unified under a single house. The Tullys were chosen by Aegon to bring order to this chaos, and they had done so effectively, creating a system of alliances and obligations that bound the fractious Riverland houses together. The Freys bent the knee to the Tullys because they had to, because the alternative was to stand alone against the combined might of a unified Riverlands, backed by Targaryen dragons. But the relationship was never easy. The Tullys expected loyalty and obedience from their vassals, expected them to answer the call to war without hesitation, to support Tully policies and positions, to show proper respect and deference. The Freys gave all of this, outwardly, but always with a kind of calculation, always assessing whether the benefits of loyalty outweighed the costs. The Tully house words, family duty honour, represented everything the Freys were not. Family, yes, the Freys understood family, but in a different way, as a network of alliances and obligations rather than as an emotional bond. Duty, certainly, but duty understood as contractual, as something you fulfilled because you'd made a bargain, not because it was inherently noble. Honour, well, honour was complicated. The Freys had their own conception of honour, one that involved keeping your word when it served your interests and breaking it when necessary for survival. This was not the Tully conception of honour, which was more absolute, more concerned with reputation and the judgment of one's peers. Over the centuries there were moments of friction between Frey and Tully, small conflicts over precedence and respect, over taxes and military obligations. The Freys chafed at being ordered about by lords they considered less capable, less wealthy, less strategically important than themselves. The Tullys grew frustrated with Frey reluctance, with the sense that the Freys were always calculating the minimum they could get away with, rather than giving their full support. But there were also moments of genuine cooperation, times when Frey and Tully worked together effectively. The Freys were valuable vassals in many ways. Their military strength was considerable. Their strategic position made them essential for controlling movement through the Riverlands. Their wealth meant they could contribute to common causes without needing financial support from their liege. A smart Tully lord could make use of all this while managing the Freys' touchiness about their status. The Freys also cultivated relationships with houses outside the Riverlands, carefully and quietly. They married daughters to lords in the Vale, in the north, in the Westerlands. They fostered sons with various houses, creating personal bonds that transcended formal political structures. They loaned money to lords who needed it, creating obligations that could be called in later. They positioned themselves as brokers and intermediaries, as the house you went to when you needed something done that required both discretion and resources. This network building was another aspect of the long game the Freys were playing. They understood that power in Westeros was about relationships as much as about armies and gold. A house with connections everywhere, with kin and allies scattered across the continent, was harder to threaten, harder to isolate, harder to destroy. The Freys were making themselves essential, weaving themselves into the fabric of Westerosi politics so thoroughly that pulling them out would damage the whole tapestry. Their unofficial house words, quote one, reflected this understanding. The phrase wasn't about noble solidarity or martial virtue. It was about the Frey family supporting each other, about the strength that came from numbers and unity, about presenting a united front to the outside world, even when there were tensions and rivalries within the family. It was pragmatic rather than inspiring, but then everything about the phrase was pragmatic. By the time we reached the generation that would experience the War of the Five Kings, House Frey had accomplished much of what the founder had envisioned. They were wealthy, powerful, essential to the functioning of the Riverlands. They had a massive family spread across Westeros, creating redundancy and connections that insulated them from many of the risks that could destroy a noble house. They had castles, lands, armies, everything that marked them as a great house in all but name. But they still lacked the one thing they'd always lacked: genuine respect. Despite 6 centuries of success, despite their obvious importance, they were still looked down upon by the older families, still treated as somewhat inferior, somewhat suspect, not quite legitimate members of the highest aristocracy. This gap between their achievements and their reception, between what they'd earned and what they were granted, created a reservoir of resentment that would have profound consequences when circumstances finally gave them the opportunity to address it. The Freys had built their house on a foundation of pragmatism and patience, of calculation and careful strategy. They had played by the rules even when those rules disadvantaged them, had accepted their place in the hierarchy even while quietly working to change it. They had bet that time and wealth and persistence would eventually give them what they desired, and for 600 years that bet had paid off. The question that history would answer was whether it had paid off enough, whether 6 centuries of patient accumulation could finally buy what gold alone had never been able to purchase: respect, acceptance, a place at the table as equals rather than as useful but slightly disreputable allies. The answer to that question would be written in blood at a wedding feast, but we're not there yet. For now, the Freys simply continued doing what they had always done: counting their gold, training their soldiers, marrying their children, and waiting for their moment. The history of House Frey, those 600 years of patient accumulation and careful strategy, would ultimately be defined by a single man: Walder Frey. Lord of the Crossing, Lord of the Twins. Head of House Frey for longer than most men live entire lives. To understand what House Frey became, to grasp the choices that would shape not just their fate, but the fate of the entire realm, we need to understand this one remarkable, difficult, deeply complicated individual. So let's slow down now, let's settle in, and explore the long life of a man who had become both the culmination of his house's ambitions and in many ways its ultimate curse. Walder Frey was born in the year 208 after Aegon's conquest, during the reign of King Daeron II, called the Good. It was a time of relative peace in Westeros, a period when the realm was recovering from the Blackfire Rebellion, when the Targaryen dynasty still seemed secure, when the old certainties of feudal order remained largely unchallenged. The world Walder was born into was one where the hierarchies were clear, where everyone knew their place. Where houses like the Freys could be wealthy and powerful, but would never quite be accepted as equals by the truly ancient nobility. He was not the firstborn son of his father. This matters, because it shaped his early life and his understanding of how power worked. Walder grew up knowing he would inherit nothing automatically, that everything he gained would have to be through his own efforts, through outliving others, or outmaneuvering them. This created a particular kind of hunger in him, a determination to survive and prosper regardless of the obstacles. It also created a certain flexibility about means and methods, a willingness to do whatever was necessary to secure his position. Through a combination of circumstance and longevity, Walder eventually became the heir to the twins. Brothers died, some in war, some from disease, some from simple accidents that were all too common in medieval life. Cousins who might have had better claims were passed over or eliminated through various political manoeuvres. Walder survived them all, outlasted them all, and when his father finally died, he inherited the crossing, the tolls, the castles, the army, everything that House Frey had built over 6 centuries. This was around the year 240 after the conquest, when Walder was already in his 30s, older than many men who inherited their titles. He had waited longer than most, had watched others die or fail, had learned patience of a particular kind. Not the patient idealism of someone working toward a noble goal, but the patient ruthlessness of someone who understands that survival is the first requirement of success, that you can't accomplish anything if you're dead, that sometimes the best strategy is simply to outlive your rivals. Walder would rule the crossing for more than 70 years, from around 240 AC until his death sometime after 300 AC, 70 years. Think about that for a moment. Most lords were fortunate to rule for 20 or 30 years. Many died in their prime from war or disease or accidents. But Walder just kept living, kept holding power, kept making decisions that affected not just his own generation, but his children's generation, and his grandchildren's generation and beyond. This extraordinary longevity was perhaps Walder's defining characteristic, the thing that shaped everything else about him, and about House Frey during his rule. He outlived almost everyone who knew him in his youth. He outlived his enemies and his friends alike. He outlived most of his children. He watched the world change around him, watched the Targaryen dynasty decline and fall, watched Robert's rebellion reshape the realm, watched winter come and go multiple times, and through it all he remained, like the bridge itself, a constant presence at the crossing. Part of his longevity might have been simple genetics, good fortune in the lottery of heredity that gives some people robust constitutions and others early graves. Part of it might have been his cautious nature, his unwillingness to take unnecessary risks, his preference for letting others fight while he calculated the odds. Part of it might have been sheer stubborn will, a refusal to die before accomplishing what he'd set out to accomplish, though what exactly that was remained always slightly unclear. But longevity alone doesn't explain Walder Frey. Many men live long lives without becoming the figure he became. What made Walder significant, what made him dangerous, was how he used those decades of power, the choices he made about family and succession, about marriage and alliance, about loyalty and betrayal. He approached his life and his rule with the same ruthless pragmatism that had characterized his house for centuries, but concentrated and refined through the force of his personality into something sharper, harder, more willing to cross lines that others might have hesitated at. Walder married 8 times over the course of his long life, 8 wives, each carefully chosen for various strategic or practical reasons, each bearing him children, each eventually dying and being replaced. The first marriages were while he was younger, in his 30s and 40s, marrying women appropriate to his station, creating alliances that strengthened House Frey's position in the Riverlands. These early wives came from good families, brought useful connections, did their duty by producing heirs. As he aged, as he became the old lord of the crossing, his later marriages took on a different character. He married much younger women, girls really, young enough to be his granddaughters. This wasn't unusual in Westerosi society, where older lords often took young wives to ensure continued production of heirs, but there was something particularly calculating about how Walder approached it. These young wives were chosen from families that needed Frey gold or Frey protection, families willing to give their daughters to an old man in exchange for alliance or wealth. It was transactional in a way that even the usual aristocratic marriages were not, stripped of any pretense of affection or partnership. Each marriage produced children, adding to the sprawling Frey family tree that would eventually encompass hundreds of individuals. Walder had legitimate sons and daughters by the dozens, and he acknowledged numerous bastards as well. The children born to various servants and minor noblewomen who caught his attention over the years. These bastards, bearing names like rivers as was customary in the Riverlands, were not treated equally to the legitimate children, but neither were they entirely cast aside. Walder found uses for all of them, legitimate and bastard alike, deploying them in various roles, marrying them to useful allies, creating a network of Freys that extended throughout Westeros. The sheer number of his descendants created both strength and weakness for House Frey. The strength came from redundancy and connections, from having family members everywhere, from the impossibility of destroying the house by killing any one person, or even any dozen people. The weakness came from the internal competition this created, the rivalries and resentments among siblings and half-siblings and cousins, all jockeying for position, all trying to win their father's favour and secure their inheritance. Walder managed this competition deliberately, playing his children and grandchildren off against each other, rewarding those who pleased him and punishing those who disappointed him, never quite making clear who would succeed him, who truly had his favour. This kept everyone on edge, kept them competing for his approval, but it also created tremendous tension within the family, resentment that simmered just below the surface, waiting for his death to erupt into open conflict. His personality shaped all of this. Walder was by all accounts sharp-tongued and bitter, quick to take offence, slow to forgive slights. He had a long memory for insults, real or perceived, and he nursed grudges for decades. This bitterness came partly from his position, from the fundamental contradiction of House Frey's situation. Wealthy and powerful but not respected, essential but not honoured, useful but not loved. Walder felt this contradiction keenly, perhaps more keenly than his ancestors had. He had wealth beyond what most lords could dream of. He had castles and armies and hundreds of descendants. He could field 4,000 men when called to war. More than many of the great houses, his toll revenues made him richer than the Tullys, richer than the Mallisters, richer than almost anyone in the Riverlands. And yet, when the great lords gathered, when the important decisions were made, when the honours were distributed, the Freys were somehow always on the periphery, always slightly excluded. Always treated as useful but inferior. This exclusion manifested in countless small ways over the decades, a feast where the Freys were seated below the salt, in positions that reflected their formal rank but not their actual power. A council where Frey opinions were noted but not seriously considered. A marriage alliance that was rejected because, well, the Freys were wealthy certainly, but were they really suitable matches for truly noble families? Each incident was minor, easily rationalised, but they accumulated over the years into a weight of disrespect that Walder carried with him always. The defining moment of his younger years, the incident that would shape how others saw him and how he saw himself, came during the War of the Ninepenny Kings. This conflict erupted around 260 AC, when Walder was in his early 50s. Still relatively young for a lord who would live into his 90s, the Blackfire pretender Maelys the Monstrous led a company of mercenaries and exiled nobles in an attempt to seize the Iron Throne, and King Jaehaerys II called his banners to meet this threat. House Tully responded to the call, and as a Tully vassal, House Frey was obligated to send men as well. Walder assembled his forces and marched them toward the conflict, but he was slow about it, taking his time, moving carefully, assessing the situation as it developed. By the time the Frey forces arrived at the siege of Seaguard, where some of the fighting had occurred, the battle was over. The Blackfires had been defeated, Maelys was dead, and the threat had passed. Technically, Walder had fulfilled his obligation. He had answered the call, had brought his men, had made them available for the war effort. It wasn't his fault that the fighting had ended before he arrived. But this wasn't how others saw it. The other lords, particularly those who had fought and bled while Walder was still marching, gave him a nickname that would follow him for the rest of his life, the late Lord Frey. The nickname was cruel in its precision. It suggested cowardice without directly accusing him of it. It implied calculation, a deliberate slowness to avoid the dangers of battle, while still technically fulfilling one's obligations. It marked him as someone who couldn't quite be trusted, who would always put his own interests first, who would arrive just in time to share the rewards but not the risks, and there was nothing Walder could do about it. He couldn't fight a nickname, couldn't demand satisfaction for an insult that was delivered with smiles and laughter, couldn't disprove what was in his heart. Only he knew whether he had been deliberately slow or simply cautious. The nickname burned in him, added to his growing reservoir of resentment against the other houses, against the whole aristocratic system that valued appearance over substance, reputation over results. He had brought his men to war, had risked his soldiers and his gold, and this was how he was thanked. The late Lord Frey, as if being alive and successful was somehow less honourable than being dead and acclaimed. This incident hardened something in Walder, reinforced his pragmatism, his sense that honour was a luxury the truly powerful could afford, but that those still climbing had to be more careful. Better to be late and alive and rich than early and dead and honoured. Better to calculate and survive than to rush in and risk everything for a reputation that wouldn't feed your children or protect your house. The other lords could laugh at him if they wanted. He would outlive them, would be there when their houses needed Frey gold, would watch them come to the crossing with requests and proposals, would have the last laugh. His relationship with House Tully grew increasingly complex over the decades of his rule. The Tullys expected loyalty from their vassals, expected them to answer calls promptly and fight without hesitation. Walder gave them loyalty, technically, but it was always grudging, always calculated. He answered the call when he had to, when the cost of refusing was greater than the cost of complying. He sent men and supplies when demanded, but never more than necessary, never with enthusiasm. He attended councils and gave counsel, but his advice was always cautious, always focused on minimising risk rather than maximising honour. Hoster Tully, who became Lord of Riverrun around 275 AC and ruled until shortly before the War of the Five Kings, was particularly frustrating to Walder. Hoster embodied everything the Tullys stood for: honour, duty, family loyalty. He was respected throughout the realm, had married his daughters to great houses, the Arryns and the Starks, had created alliances that strengthened his position. He was everything Walder was not and could never be, and Walder resented him for it even as he acknowledged Hoster's political skill. The two men had an uneasy relationship, each understanding the other's value but neither particularly liking or trusting the other. Hoster needed the Freys, needed their military strength and their strategic position. Walder needed the Tullys, needed the legitimacy that came from being a loyal vassal to a respected house. But there was no warmth in the relationship, no genuine friendship or affection, just calculation on both sides. Mutual use masquerading as feudal loyalty. Walder's treatment of his own family was another aspect of his character that demands our attention. With so many children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren, he could hardly maintain close relationships with all of them, and he didn't try. Instead, he sorted them, categorized them, evaluated them based on their usefulness to House Frey's interests. The clever ones, the ambitious ones, the ones who showed promise, these he cultivated, gave responsibilities to, tested with increasingly important tasks. His heir for most of his rule was his eldest son Stevron, a man who was patient to the point of sainthood, who waited decade after decade for his father to die so he could finally rule the crossing. Stevron was by most accounts a decent man, more honourable than his father, less willing to cross certain lines, more concerned with House Frey's reputation than with pure calculation. But he was also old himself by the time our story reaches the War of the Five Kings in his late 60s, having spent his entire adult life waiting, preparing to be lord, never quite achieving it. Walder's other sons and grandsons occupied various positions in the household and in the military. Some commanded garrisons, some managed estates, some served as envoys or negotiators. The ones Walder favoured received the best positions. The ones who disappointed him were sent to minor posts or excluded from important decisions. He played them against each other, encouraged competition, created an environment where family loyalty was always secondary to demonstrating one's value to the Lord of the Crossing. Among his grandsons, several stood out for various reasons. Black Walder, named for his dark hair and darker disposition, was particularly ruthless, willing to do whatever his grandfather required without hesitation or moral qualm. Red Walder was almost as bad, known for his temper and his violence. Walder Frey was different, more like his father Stevron, more concerned with honour and doing right. Walder Frey the grandson, not to be confused with all the other Walders in the family, occupied yet another position in the complex hierarchy. The women of House Frey, Walder's daughters and granddaughters, were treated primarily as assets to be traded in marriage alliances. This was not unusual in Westerosi society, where noble daughters were expected to marry for political advantage rather than for love. But there was something particularly calculating about how Walder approached his daughters' marriages, something that stripped even the usual pretense of concern for their happiness or well-being. They were pieces to be moved on a board, connections to be made, alliances to be purchased with youth and beauty and Frey dowries. Some of these marriages were successful, creating useful alliances and producing children who strengthened House Frey's position. Others were disasters, matching Frey daughters with cruel or incompetent husbands, trapping them in loveless marriages far from home. Walder didn't particularly care which category any particular marriage fell into as long as it served his purposes. The happiness of individual daughters was irrelevant to the larger project of advancing House Frey. As Walder aged into his 80s and 90s as he became truly ancient by Westerosi standards, his personality grew more bitter and his behaviour more erratic. He took his 8th wife when he was already in his 90s, a girl of 15 or 16, young enough to be his great-great-granddaughter. This marriage was scandalous even by Westerosi standards, but Walder didn't care. He wanted young flesh in his bed, wanted to prove he was still virile, still capable, still alive in all the ways that mattered. The fact that others found it distasteful only made him more determined to do it. His court at the Twins became a place of tension and barely suppressed conflict. His many sons and grandsons jockeyed for position, knowing that the old man couldn't live forever despite all evidence to the contrary, preparing for the succession struggle that would erupt when he finally died. His daughters and granddaughters navigated the complex social dynamics, trying to secure good marriages or good positions for their own children. His bastards skulked on the margins, acknowledged but not fully accepted, useful but not truly valued. And through it all, Walder sat in his seat at the Twins, collecting his tolls, managing his house, nursing his grievances, waiting. He had outlived 8 wives, had outlived most of his children, had outlived entire generations of other lords who had looked down on him. He had seen the Targaryen dynasty fall and the Baratheon dynasty rise. He had seen wars and rebellions and winters. He had seen his house grow stronger with each passing year. Had seen the Frey family tree spread until it encompassed hundreds of individuals scattered across Westeros. But he had never quite achieved what he wanted most: respect. True respect. Not the grudging acknowledgement that came from wealth and military power, but the kind of respect that was given to houses like the Starks and the Arryns and even the Tullys. The respect that came from honour and ancient lineage and a reputation for nobility. This remained forever out of reach. No matter how long he lived, no matter how wealthy he became, no matter how many alliances he made. The late Lord Frey could never escape that nickname, could never quite wash away the taint of being new money, toll collectors, useful but not honourable. This failure, this gap between what he had achieved and what he desired, would ultimately drive the decision that would define House Frey's legacy. After 90 years of life, after 70 years of rule, after decades of calculation and patience and careful strategy, Walder Frey would finally be given an opportunity to address the fundamental injustice he perceived in how his house was treated, and he would take that opportunity, would cross a line that even he had never crossed before, would violate the most sacred laws of Westerosi society in pursuit of the advancement and recognition he believed House Frey deserved. But that decision and its consequences come later. For now, Walder simply continued what he had always done, what he would do until he finally died, surviving, calculating, resenting, and waiting for his moment. If you're finding these contemplative explorations of Westerosi history and politics a peaceful way to end your day, a like and subscribe really helps others discover these gentle journeys through the past. And to those already subscribed, thank you for being part of this community of those who find comfort in slowly unfolding stories of power and patience, of roses growing strong through centuries of careful cultivation. Walder Frey's longevity and his 8 marriages created something unprecedented in Westerosi history. A family so large and complex that it became almost impossible to map completely. A web of relationships so tangled that even the masters who tried to chronicle it sometimes gave up in frustration. To understand House Frey at the time of the War of the Five Kings, we need to explore this vast family tree to meet at least some of the individuals who made it up, to understand how this sprawling clan functioned as both a source of strength and a fundamental weakness. So let's slow down now, let's breathe, and let's try to make sense of the hundreds of people who called themselves Frey. The basic structure was theoretically simple, following the standard pattern of feudal inheritance. Walder's eldest son Stevron was the heir, and Stevron's sons would inherit after him, and so on down the generations. But nothing about the Freys was simple in practice, because Walder had so many children by so many different mothers, and because he had lived so long that the generations had become confused, overlapping in strange ways. Stevron Frey, the patient heir, had been born to Walder's first wife sometime in the early 230s AC, which made him close to 70 years old by the time the War of the Five Kings began. Stevron had spent his entire adult life as heir to the crossing, watching his father rule, learning the business of managing the tolls and the armies, preparing for a lordship he was beginning to suspect he might never actually achieve. His father just kept living, kept making decisions, kept holding power with hands that grew wrinkled but never seemed to weaken their grip. Stevron had married and had children of his own, and those children had grown and married and had children, creating a whole branch of the Frey family tree that stemmed from him. His eldest son was Ryman, a man in his 40s who was known more for his love of drink and whores than for any particular capability. Ryman had disappointed both his father and his grandfather, had proven himself unreliable in various small ways that added up to a general sense that he wasn't fit for command. But he was the eldest son of the eldest son, which meant he was technically third in line for the crossing, assuming both Walder and Stevron died in their proper order. Ryman's own sons included Edwin, who was more capable than his father, but perhaps too rigid in his thinking. Too concerned with proper form and not enough with practical results. Then there was Black Walder, named for Walder Frey, but called Black for his dark hair and darker nature. Black Walder was dangerous, clever and ruthless, and completely without the moral qualms that might have restrained a more honourable man. He was the kind of grandson old Walder appreciated, the kind who understood that power was what mattered, and honour was just a word people used to justify their weaknesses. Through Stevron's other sons and daughters, the family tree branched further. Sir Aemond Frey had married Jenna Lannister, a daughter of Tytos Lannister and sister to Lord Tywin himself. This was actually an impressive match for a Frey, though it had happened decades ago when the Lannisters were less powerful, and the marriage had been seen as somewhat beneath Jenna's station. Still, it created a connection to the wealthiest and most powerful house in Westeros, and the children of that union, half Frey and half Lannister, occupied an interesting position in both family trees. Sir Aenys Frey was another of Stevron's sons, father to numerous children himself, spreading the Frey blood further. Perianne Frey had married into House Hay, creating another branch of alliances. The marriages went on, each creating new connections, new complications, new individuals who could claim Frey blood and Frey support. But Stevron's branch was only one part of the tree, and not even the largest part. Walder's second son was Aemond Frey, born to his second wife. Aemond had his own children and grandchildren, creating a whole separate branch that rivaled Stevron's in size and complexity. Then came Aenys Frey from the third wife, and Perianne from another marriage. And the names began to blur together, to repeat in confusing ways because Walder kept naming children after previous children, or after himself, or after other members of the family he particularly favoured at the moment. There were legitimate daughters too, dozens of them, married to lords and knights across the Riverlands and beyond. Arwen Frey had married into House Beesbury in the Reach. Perianne had married into House Hay. Beone had married into House Erenford. Each marriage created obligations and expectations, created more people who could call on Frey support or who owed the Freys favours in return. The network spread like roots through soil, invisible but strong, connecting House Frey to dozens of other families. The younger sons from Walder's later marriages created additional complications. These men were sometimes the same age as their nephews or even younger than them, creating strange dynamics where an uncle might be a young man looking up to his older nephew, where the normal hierarchies of age and respect were confused by the overlapping generations. Walder's 6th and 7th and 8th wives had produced children who were still young when the War of the Five Kings began. Children who had elderly half-siblings old enough to be their grandparents. Among the younger generation of Freys, several individuals stood out for various reasons. Walder Frey was unusual among his relatives for having something like genuine honour, a concern for doing right that was rare in the family. He was handsome and personable, skilled with weapons, the kind of young man who might have been an exemplar of chivalry if he'd been born into a different house. His position in the family tree was complex, as were most Freys, but he'd been chosen to serve as squire to Robb Stark when the young wolf needed to cross at the Twins. A position of trust that suggested Walder was one of the more acceptable Freys. Perwyn Frey was another of the younger generation who seemed to have escaped the family's worst characteristics. He was quiet, thoughtful, more interested in books and music than in the usual pursuits of young nobles. He'd been fostered at various houses and had absorbed some of their values, had developed loyalties beyond just the family and its interests. Whether this made him weak or admirable depended on your perspective, but it certainly made him different from most of his relatives. Then there were the granddaughters, the young Frey women who would be used as pieces in marriage alliances just as their mothers and aunts had been before them. Roslyn Frey was considered particularly beautiful. With a gentle nature that seemed at odds with the family she'd been born into, she'd been kept close to the twins, carefully preserved for whatever alliance old Walder decided would be most advantageous. Her fate, like that of all Frey daughters, was to be decided by her grandfather's calculations rather than by her own wishes or feelings. Arwen Frey, not to be confused with the earlier Arwen who'd married into House Beesbury, was another granddaughter, as was Shrey and Marianne and half a dozen others, whose names blurred together in the complex family tree. Each had her own personality, her own hopes and dreams, her own understanding of what it meant to be a Frey. But their individuality mattered less than their utility as alliance makers. Their value measured in what marriages they could contract rather than in who they were as people. The bastards added yet another layer of complexity. Walder had acknowledged numerous bastard children over his long life, the products of affairs with servants and minor noblewomen, with camp followers and village girls. In the Riverlands, bastards took the surname Rivers, and there were enough Frey Rivers to constitute their own small branch of the family tree. They were not treated equally to the legitimate children, of course, but neither were they entirely cast out. Walder found uses for them, positions that required competence but didn't convey the prestige or authority that legitimate children received. Some of these bastards were clever and capable. Had they been born legitimate, they might have been valued members of the family. As it was, they occupied an uncomfortable middle ground, neither fully inside nor fully outside the family structure. Useful but never quite trusted, employed but never quite honoured. This created its own tensions and resentments. Another set of rivalries layered over the already complex dynamics of legitimate succession. The sheer size of the family created practical problems that had to be managed. Housing alone was a challenge. The twins were large castles, but even they couldn't comfortably accommodate hundreds of Freys plus their servants and retainers. Many of the family members lived elsewhere, in smaller keeps and towers that Walder had acquired over the years, in the houses of their spouses, in apartments in various Riverland towns. But enough lived at the twins that the castles were perpetually crowded, full of children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren, all competing for space and attention. Feeding this multitude required careful management. The twins maintained enormous kitchens that operated almost constantly, preparing meals for the household and for the travellers who paid tolls and sometimes paid extra for meals and accommodation. The Frey lands had to be productive enough to support this population, which meant careful agricultural management, attention to harvests and herds. The kind of mundane economic calculation that the Freys excelled at, but that more romantic houses might have considered beneath their dignity. The family dynamics were Byzantine in their complexity. Older brothers resented younger brothers who seemed to have gained more of their father's favour. Legitimate children looked down on bastards who sometimes proved more capable. Children of earlier marriages competed with children of later marriages for position and resources. Grandsons and granddaughters navigated relationships with uncles and aunts who were the same age as them or younger. The whole structure was held together primarily by Walder's iron control, and by the understanding that despite all their internal conflicts, the Freys needed to present a united front to the outside world. This unity was more appearance than reality, though everyone participated in maintaining the fiction. When the family gathered for feasts or councils, they sat in careful order, legitimate before bastard, older before younger, sons before daughters. They used the proper forms of address, showed the appropriate respect, maintained the hierarchies that Walder insisted upon. But beneath this surface order there were dozens of small rivalries and resentments, scores being kept, alliances being made and broken, all the normal human messiness multiplied by the sheer number of people involved. Walder encouraged much of this competition, believed it kept everyone sharp, kept them trying to prove their worth to him and to the house. He would praise one grandson in front of others, creating jealousy. He would give important tasks to a younger son, passing over an older one, keeping everyone uncertain about their standing. He would hint at changing the succession, suggest that maybe Steveron wasn't the best choice after all, that perhaps someone else should inherit the crossing. He never followed through on these hints, but the uncertainty itself was useful to him, kept everyone competing, kept everyone focused on gaining his approval. The cost of this approach was enormous, though Walder either didn't see it or didn't care. The family was fractured beneath its surface unity, full of people who resented each other, who would happily see each other fail, who were loyal to House Frey in the abstract but not necessarily to each other. When Walder finally died, when his iron grip was released, the family would likely tear itself apart in a succession struggle. Multiple branches would claim the crossing, multiple factions would form, and the civil war that resulted could destroy everything the house had built over 6 centuries. But perhaps Walder calculated that he would be dead by then, that what happened after his death wasn't his problem. Or perhaps he believed that the struggle itself would be good for the house, that whoever emerged victorious would be strong enough to rule effectively, tempered by conflict the way steel is tempered by fire. Or perhaps, and this seems most likely, he simply enjoyed the power, enjoyed keeping everyone uncertain and competing, enjoyed being the centre of attention and the arbiter of all disputes. The longevity that should have been a blessing had become in some ways a curse, trapping the family in perpetual adolescence, unable to mature or develop independence while the patriarch still lived. The younger Freys, those born in the last few decades of Walder's life, grew up in this strange environment, learning that family loyalty was conditional, that favour had to be earned and could be lost, that survival meant calculation and competition. They learned to watch their siblings and cousins carefully, to assess who was rising and who was falling in their grandfather's estimation. They learned that honour was something other people valued but that Freys couldn't afford, that pragmatism and results were what mattered, that the family's advancement came before individual feelings or moral qualms. Some internalized these lessons completely and became ruthless operators like Black Walder, willing to do anything to advance themselves and the family. Others, like Oliver and Perwyn, resisted to varying degrees, tried to hold on to some conception of honour and decency, despite the environment they'd grown up in. Most fell somewhere in between, pragmatic when necessary but not entirely without conscience, calculating but not completely amoral, shaped by their upbringing but not entirely defined by it. The family's reputation affected all of them, regardless of their individual characters. To be a Frey meant carrying certain assumptions, certain expectations. People expected Freys to be calculating, to be concerned primarily with wealth and advantage, to be unreliable in matters of honour. This wasn't entirely fair to the individuals, some of whom were genuinely honourable people trying to navigate a difficult situation, but fairness had little to do with reputation in Westeros. The family's character, built over generations and concentrated through Walder's particular approach to leadership, had created a brand that stuck to every member whether they deserved it or not. The marriages that Walder arranged for his descendants were strategic to the point of coldness. He matched his children and grandchildren to houses that could offer advantages, military alliances, political support, access to resources or territory. He paid substantial dowries for his daughters, using Frey gold to buy matches that bloodline alone couldn't secure. He accepted lower status matches for his sons when those matches brought other advantages, land or loyalty or access to particular regions. These marriages created a network that extended throughout the Riverlands and beyond. There were Frey sons and daughters in the Vale, in the Westerlands, in the Reach, creating connections that could be activated when needed. There were Frey grandchildren with mixed loyalties, torn between their Frey blood and their loyalty to their other house, their mother's family or their father's. This network was valuable, but it also created complications, situations where Frey interests conflicted with the interests of these allied houses, where family members found themselves on opposite sides of disputes. The massive family also created redundancy that protected House Frey against the usual risks that could destroy a noble house. Lose one son in battle, and there were a dozen more to continue the line. Lose one daughter to childbirth, and there were 20 more to make advantageous marriages. Have one grandson prove incompetent, and there were 50 others who might do better. This redundancy was valuable in a world where death was common and succession crises could end dynasties, but it also meant that individual lives mattered less, that each person was more replaceable, a piece in a larger game rather than a unique individual. The servants at the Twins had to learn to navigate this complex family structure, had to remember which Walder was which branch of the family each person belonged to, who had favour and who didn't. They became expert at reading the subtle signals of status and power, at knowing who to defer to and who could be safely ignored. They witnessed the family's internal dynamics, the rivalries and alliances, the betrayals and reconciliations, and they gossiped about it in the kitchens and the stables, spreading stories about the Freys throughout the Riverlands. By the time Walder Frey was in his 90s, by the time the War of the Five Kings began, his family had grown to truly staggering proportions. There were perhaps 200 people who could legitimately claim Frey blood. And that number grew every year as the younger generations continued to marry and produce children. The family tree was so complex that even members of the family sometimes lost track of exactly how they were related to each other, whether someone was a second cousin or a half-nephew or some other combination of relationships that ordinary language struggled to describe. This massive family was House Frey's greatest strength and its greatest vulnerability. The strength came from numbers, from the impossibility of destroying the house completely, from the network of alliances and connections that the family represented. The vulnerability came from the internal divisions, from the fact that so many Freys resented each other, from the succession crisis that would inevitably follow Walder's death, from the way that individual loyalty to the family as a whole competed with personal ambitions and resentments. When crisis came, when the War of the Five Kings erupted and Robb Stark needed to cross at the Twins, when Walder Frey had to make decisions that would affect not just his generation but all the generations to come, this massive family would be both an asset and a liability. Some Freys would support the choices their grandfather made, would participate willingly or at least obediently. Others would object, would try to maintain their own honour even as the family's honour was being compromised. And all of them, whether they agreed with what was done or not, would share in the consequences, would carry the weight of decisions made by an old man who had lived too long and wanted too much, and was willing to cross lines that should never have been crossed. The Frey family tree, that sprawling structure of hundreds of individuals connected by blood and marriage and shared interest, would bear the weight of those decisions for generations, assuming the family survived at all once Walder's iron grip finally loosened and the structure he'd built was tested by his absence. This sprawling Frey family existed within a particular context, within the political landscape of the Riverlands and their relationship with the other houses that made up that fractured, often troubled region. To understand why the Freys made the choices they made, why their resentments ran so deep, we need to explore their position as vassals, their relationships with their liege lords and their fellow bannermen, the subtle ways in which wealth and power didn't translate into respect or acceptance. So let's settle in now, let's breathe slowly, and let's examine what it meant to be a Frey in the Riverlands, to be essential but not honoured, powerful but not loved. House Tully of Riverrun had been the paramount house of the Riverlands since Aegon's conquest, elevated to that position by the Targaryens as a reward for Lord Edmund Tully's early submission. Before the conquest, the Riverlands had never been unified under a single house, had been a patchwork of competing powers constantly invaded by the Ironborn from the west and the Stormlands from the south. The Tullys were chosen to bring order to this chaos, and over 3 centuries they had done so, creating a system of overlapping obligations and alliances that bound the contentious Riverland houses together. The Tully words, family, duty, honour, represented an ideal that the Riverlands lords were supposed to aspire to, a framework for understanding what it meant to be part of this feudal system. Family meant caring for your kin, supporting your house, ensuring the continuation of your line. Duty meant fulfilling your obligations to your liege lord, answering calls to arms, paying your taxes, providing counsel when asked. Honour meant keeping your word, maintaining your reputation, conducting yourself in a manner befitting nobility. House Frey understood these concepts, but they interpreted them differently than the Tullys might have wished. Family for the Freys was indeed important, but it was understood more as a network of alliances than as an emotional bond. The family stood together because there was strength in numbers, because supporting each other served everyone's interests, not because of some abstract ideal of familial love. Duty was something you fulfilled when the benefits outweighed the costs, when refusing would create more problems than complying. Honour was complicated, perhaps even suspect. A luxury that those with secure positions could afford, but that those still climbing had to be more careful about. This philosophical difference created ongoing tension between Frey and Tully. Lord Hoster Tully, who ruled Riverrun for several decades leading up to the War of the Five Kings, embodied the Tully ideals completely. He was honourable in the traditional sense, concerned with his reputation and his house's standing, willing to make personal sacrifices for abstract principles. He had married his daughters to great houses not primarily for wealth or immediate advantage, but to create alliances built on mutual respect and shared values. Catelyn had married Eddard Stark, becoming Lady of Winterfell. Lisa had married Jon Arryn, becoming Lady of the Eyrie. These marriages elevated House Tully's prestige considerably, connected them to 2 of the most ancient and respected houses in Westeros. Walder Frey watched these marriages with a mixture of envy and contempt. Envy because the Tullys, despite being less wealthy than the Freys, despite fielding smaller armies, could make such prestigious matches. Contempt because he saw the marriages as impractical, based more on sentiment and reputation than on cold calculation of advantage. The Starks were honourable, certainly, but what did honour gain you? The Arryns were ancient and prestigious, but they were isolated in the Vale, not particularly useful as military allies in conflicts that didn't directly concern them. Hoster, for his part, found Walder frustrating and somewhat distasteful. The old Lord of the Crossing was useful, certainly, controlled an essential strategic position, could field substantial forces when needed, but there was something off-putting about his naked ambition, his obvious resentment, his tendency to calculate everything in terms of immediate advantage. Host valued loyalty that came from shared values and mutual respect, not loyalty that had to be constantly purchased through concessions and rewards. The relationship between the two men had been tested repeatedly over the decades. During Robert's rebellion, when the realm tore itself apart over whether Robert Baratheon or the Mad King Aerys Targaryen should sit the Iron Throne, Hoster Tully had sided with the rebels. He brought the Riverlands into the war against the Targaryens, called his banners, fought battles that cost Riverland lives and treasure. Walder Frey answered the call, technically brought his men to join the Tully forces, but he was slow about it, cautious, clearly calculating which side was likely to win before fully committing. This caution proved wise from a purely practical standpoint. The rebels won, Robert took the throne, and those who had supported him were rewarded, while those who had supported the Targaryens were punished, or at best viewed with suspicion. Walder's late arrival meant he shared in the victory without having risked as much as others, without having committed his forces when the outcome was still uncertain. But it also meant he was seen as unreliable, as someone who calculated too carefully, who valued his own safety over his duty to his liege. The nickname, the late Lord Frey, was reinforced by this pattern of behaviour. It wasn't just the War of the Ninepenny Kings anymore. It was a consistent approach to military obligation, a pattern of being technically obedient while actually being as cautious and self-protective as possible. Walder would answer the call, would bring his men, would fulfill the letter of his obligations, but he would do so in ways that minimised his risk and maximised his options, that allowed him to claim loyalty while actually preserving his freedom to manoeuvre. The other Riverland houses noticed this pattern, and they resented it. Houses like Blackwood and Bracken, ancient enemies who nonetheless both took their obligations to the Tully seriously, looked down on the Freys for their caution. House Mallister of Seaguard, whose keep guarded the coast against Ironborn raids, who fought and bled regularly in defence of the Riverlands, considered the Freys to be less than reliable allies. House Vance and House Piper, loyal Tully bannermen, treated the Freys with suspicion born of long experience with Frey calculation. This exclusion manifested in countless small ways. At councils of the Riverland lords, Frey voices were heard but not particularly valued. At feasts and celebrations, the Freys were invited because excluding them would be politically unwise. But they were seated in positions that reflected their formal status rather than their actual power or wealth. In the informal networks of friendship and alliance that bound the Riverland nobility together, the Freys were perpetually on the outside, never quite part of the inner circle despite their obvious importance. Marriage alliances reflected this exclusion as well, while Walder married his children and grandchildren strategically, creating connections throughout the Riverlands and beyond. The matches were never quite as prestigious as he might have wished. A Frey daughter might marry a younger son of a good house, but rarely the heir. A Frey son might marry into a respectable family, but not into the most distinguished lines. The really prestigious matches, the ones that connected great houses to each other, were generally closed to the Freys despite their wealth. There were occasional exceptions that highlighted the rule. The marriage of Emmon Frey to Jenna Lannister was the most notable example. Jenna was the daughter of Lord Tytos Lannister, sister to the formidable Tywin Lannister, a woman of sharp wit and strong personality. Her marriage to a Frey had been arranged when she was young, when the Lannisters were less powerful and the match seemed more reasonable. By the time of our story, with Tywin as one of the most powerful men in Westeros, the marriage seemed almost insulting in retrospect. A brilliant woman married to a Frey. Her children caught between two very different family cultures. Jenna herself reportedly resented the match, felt that she had been wasted on someone beneath her station, but she'd made the best of it, had maintained her Lannister connections while navigating the complex politics of being a Frey by marriage. Her children were half Lannister, which gave them status that pure Freys lacked. but they were also half Frey, which marked them as not quite legitimate in Lannister circles. They occupied an uncomfortable middle ground, belonging fully to neither house, useful to both, but entirely trusted by neither. The Frey's wealth created its own problems in their relationship with other Riverland houses. They were richer than most of their neighbours, richer even than the Tullys in terms of liquid assets and annual revenue. This should have given them status and influence, but in the aristocratic culture of Westeros, the source of wealth mattered as much as its amount. Wealth from ancient lands, from hereditary holdings passed down through countless generations, was respectable. Wealth from conquest, from military prowess and the spoils of war was admirable. But wealth from tolls, from charging fees for passage across a bridge, was somehow tainted, commercial, beneath the dignity of true nobility. This prejudice was irrational in many ways. The Freys had built their bridge, had created something of value, had risked their fortune on a massive construction project that benefited everyone who used it. They maintained the crossing, kept it safe and functional, provided a service that made trade and travel easier throughout the region. They employed hundreds of people, generated economic activity, contributed to the prosperity of the Riverlands as a whole. But none of this mattered to nobles who valued inherited prestige over demonstrated capability, who saw commerce as fundamentally inferior to the traditional sources of aristocratic power. Walder understood this prejudice and resented it deeply. He saw other houses, poorer and weaker than his own, treated with more respect simply because they were older, or because their wealth came from sources the aristocracy considered more legitimate. He saw lords with smaller armies and less impressive fortifications given precedence over him, simply because of their lineage. He saw the gap between what House Frey had achieved and how they were valued, and it burned in him like a slow fire that never quite went out. This resentment affected how the Freys interacted with their fellow Riverland lords. They were prickly about matters of precedence and respect, quick to take offence at real or perceived slights, prone to nursing grudges over incidents that others might have dismissed as trivial. They kept careful track of who had insulted them, who had shown proper respect, who had acknowledged their importance and who had treated them as inferior. This accounting shaped their alliances and their enmities, their willingness to cooperate or their tendency to obstruct. House Blackwood and House Bracken, those ancient rivals whose feud stretched back thousands of years, were both wary of the Freys. The Blackwoods, who still kept the old gods and maintained their ancient godswood with its enormous weirwood tree, considered themselves the more honourable and ancient house in the Riverlands. They looked down on the Freys as nouveau riche, as upstarts who had bought their way to prominence rather than earning it through valour or ancient right. The Brackens, who followed the Seven and claimed descent from the First Men through a different line, were equally dismissive, viewing the Freys as wealthy merchants playing at nobility. The mutual hatred between Blackwood and Bracken was so intense that they could hardly agree on anything, but they seemed to agree on looking down on the Freys. This united contempt from two houses that agreed on nothing else must have been particularly galling to Walder, confirmation that the prejudice against his house was deep and widely shared, not just the quirk of a few particularly snobbish lords. House Mallister of Seagard had a different reason for their complicated relationship with the Freys. The Mallisters were warriors, defenders of the coast, constantly vigilant against iron-born raids. Their seat at Seagard was built to withstand attack from the sea, and they took their defensive responsibilities seriously, had fought countless battles against iron-born reavers over the centuries. This martial culture created a particular set of values, an emphasis on courage and immediate action, on defending what was yours and never backing down from a fight. The Frey approach to warfare, cautious and calculated, was antithetical to Mallister values. Where a Mallister lord would rush to battle, would defend his territory with immediate and overwhelming force, a Frey would calculate odds, would assess whether fighting served his interests, would look for ways to minimise risk even at the cost of appearing less than fully committed. The Mallisters saw this as cowardice, or at least as something less than the martial virtue they prized. The Freys saw it as simple pragmatism, as understanding that dead heroes couldn't protect their families or advance their houses. The tensions between these different approaches to lordship, to honour, to the obligations of nobility, created an atmosphere of mutual suspicion and resentment that poisoned relationships throughout the Riverlands. The region had never been truly unified, had always been a collection of competing powers bound together by the Tully overlordship but never quite merging into a coherent whole. The Freys were part of this fractious landscape, but their particular position, wealthy and powerful but not respected, made them especially sensitive to these tensions. Walder's military strength was substantial, which should have given him influence but somehow didn't, or at least not as much as he thought it should. He could call up nearly 4,000 men when needed, a force larger than many of his neighbours could muster, nearly as large as what the Tullys themselves could field from their direct holdings. These men were reasonably well trained and equipped, paid for by Frey gold. Loyal to the crossing because the Freys could afford to maintain them and reward them properly. But military strength without respect is a dangerous thing in feudal society. Other lords acknowledged that the Freys were powerful, that they controlled a strategic location, that they couldn't be easily dismissed or ignored. But this acknowledgement was grudging, accompanied by muttered comments about wealth buying what valour should earn, about armies paid with toll money rather than supported by loyal vassals out of genuine fealty. The Freys had the power, but not the mystique, the capability, but not the prestige. This created a situation where Walder was perpetually calculating whether he was being properly valued, whether his support was being adequately rewarded, whether he was receiving the respect and deference that his actual power should command. And by his accounting, the answer was always no. He was always being undervalued, always being slighted, always being treated as less important than he actually was. This sense of perpetual injury, of never quite receiving what was due, shaped his decision-making in ways that would eventually have catastrophic consequences. The physical layout of the Riverlands reinforced these political dynamics. The twins sat at a crucial crossing, controlling north-south movement through the region. River Run, the Tully seat, controlled the confluence of the Red Fork and the Tumblestone, dominating the western Riverlands. Seagard guarded the coast in the west, protecting against Ironborn incursions. Harrenhal, that enormous ruin, sat brooding on the shore of the God's Eye, a reminder of what Dragonfire could do to even the mightiest fortress. These geographic strongpoints created a network of power that the Tullys had to manage carefully. Each house that controlled such a position had leverage, had the ability to complicate or facilitate the movement of people and armies, to support or resist Tully authority. The Tullys maintained their paramount position through a combination of military strength, political skill, and the network of alliances and obligations they had built over 3 centuries. But it was always a delicate balance, always requiring careful attention to the pride and interests of their various vassals. The Freys understood this balance and used their position at the twins to maximum advantage. They were too important to be ignored, too strategically placed to be bypassed, too wealthy to be bullied. This gave them a kind of negative power, the ability to obstruct and complicate even when they couldn't directly control. Walder used this power carefully, never pushing so hard that the Tullys would be forced to confront him directly, but always reminding everyone that the crossing was essential, that the Freys had to be accommodated and their interest considered. The toll system itself was a constant reminder of this power, and a constant source of resentment. Every lord who crossed at the twins, every merchant, every messenger had to pay. The fees were not exorbitant. Walder was too clever to price himself out of the market, to make the tolls so high that people would choose the long detour instead. But they were substantial enough to generate enormous revenue. And they were universal enough that virtually every important person in the Riverlands had paid Frey tolls at some point, had contributed to Frey wealth whether they liked it or not. This created a peculiar dynamic where the other Riverland lords were literally paying the Freys for the privilege of using infrastructure in their own region, enriching a house they looked down on, contributing to the wealth that allowed the Freys to compete with and sometimes overshadow their supposed betters. The irony was not lost on anyone, and it added another layer of resentment to relationships that were already strained. By the time the War of the Five Kings began, by the time Robb Stark would need to cross at the Twins and Walder Frey would have to decide how to respond, these tensions had been building for decades, for generations, for centuries really. The Freys were wealthy and powerful but not respected. They were essential but not honoured. They were useful but not loved. They had built something remarkable and had never been properly acknowledged for it. They had played by the rules of feudal society and had never been granted the full benefits that those rules supposedly promised to those who accumulated power and wealth. Walder Frey, in his 10th decade of life, carrying the accumulated resentments of a lifetime and the inherited grievances of generations, was waiting for an opportunity to finally demonstrate that House Frey deserved respect, that their wealth and power should translate into status and honour, that the late Lord Frey was not someone to be dismissed or looked down upon. When that opportunity came, when circumstances placed enormous leverage in his hands, he would use it in a way that shocked even a realm accustomed to political ruthlessness. But that choice, that terrible calculation, came from somewhere. It came from 600 years of building and being dismissed, of accumulating power and being excluded, of serving loyally enough to survive but never quite enough to be truly valued. The Riverlands had made the Freys what they were, through centuries of subtle exclusion and obvious prejudice, and the Riverlands would pay the price for that failure of respect in blood and horror and broken oaths. All of these tensions, all of these centuries of accumulated resentment and careful calculation would come to a head when war erupted across Westeros in the year 298 after Aegon's conquest. The War of the Five Kings, as it would come to be known, would test every alliance and expose every weakness in the feudal system that bound the realm together. For House Frey, it would present both enormous opportunity and terrible temptation, a moment when the leverage they had accumulated over 600 years could finally be converted into something more valuable, or could be squandered in pursuit of respect that might prove impossible to purchase at any price. Let's slow down now, let's breathe, and let's explore how Walder Frey navigated the outbreak of this war, the choices he made, and the bargain he struck that would set everything else in motion. The war began with the death of King Robert Baratheon and the chaos of succession that followed. Robert had ruled for 15 years after his rebellion against the Targaryens, had brought a kind of rough stability to the realm despite his personal failings. But his death in a hunting accident, or what appeared to be an accident, opened questions about who should succeed him. His supposed son Joffrey claimed the throne, but rumours spread that Joffrey and his siblings were actually bastards fathered by Jaime Lannister, the Queen's twin brother, rather than legitimate children of Robert. Eddard Stark, Hand of the King and Robert's closest friend, tried to address this succession crisis and was executed for his troubles, beheaded on the steps of the Great Sept of Baelor in King's Landing. His death transformed what might have been a political dispute into open war. Eddard's son Robb, barely more than a boy at 15 years old, was declared king in the north by his father's bannermen. Robb's maternal grandfather, Hoster Tully, called his own banners in the Riverlands, bringing the region into the war on the side of the north against the Iron Throne. This created an immediate problem for Robb and the northern forces to link up with his Tully grandfather and the Riverland armies to create a unified fighting force that could challenge the Lannisters who controlled the crown. Robb needed to march his army south from the north, and to march south quickly. To avoid the long detour that would give his enemies time to prepare, he needed to cross at the Twins. He needed Walder Frey's permission and cooperation. Walder, for his part, watched these developments with the calculating eye he had turned on political situations for 9 decades. Here was an opportunity, perhaps the greatest opportunity House Frey had ever faced. The young wolf needed something from him, needed it desperately, needed it urgently. This gave Walder leverage, the ability to set terms, to extract concessions that would normally be far beyond what a vassal house could demand from a great house like the Starks. The situation was deliciously ironic from Walder's perspective. The Starks were one of the oldest and most prestigious houses in Westeros, tracing their lineage back 8,000 years to the Age of Heroes. They were kings in the north before Aegon's conquest, had bent the knee to the Targaryens but maintained enormous prestige and autonomy. They were everything the Freys were not: ancient, honoured, respected throughout the realm for their adherence to old codes of honour and duty. And now they needed the Freys, needed the bridge that 600 years of Frey pragmatism had built and maintained. Robb Stark approached the twins with an army of perhaps 20,000 Northmen, a substantial force but not large enough to simply force a crossing if Walder chose to oppose him. The twins could be held by a much smaller force, and attempting to storm them would be costly in time and lives, would give the Lannisters opportunity to consolidate their position or attack, while Robb was tied down at the crossing. Robb needed to negotiate, needed to convince Walder to let him pass, ideally to join his cause with Frey men and Frey support. The negotiation took place in the Great Hall of the Twins, with Walder sitting in his lord's seat surrounded by his many sons and grandsons, facing the young Stark king and his advisors. Walder was in his 90s by this point, ancient and wrinkled but still sharp, still calculating, still very much in control of his faculties and his house. He looked at Robb Stark, this boy of 15 who had been declared a king, and he saw opportunity. Walder's opening position was characteristically blunt. Why should he let Robb cross? Why should he risk Lannister wrath by supporting a rebellion? The Lannisters were powerful, wealthy, ruthless in pursuing their enemies. If Walder sided with Robb and Robb lost, the Freys would face terrible retribution. Casterly Rock had gold beyond counting, had armies that had never been defeated, had a reputation for utterly destroying those who opposed them. What could Robb offer that would be worth such a risk? Robb, young and relatively inexperienced in such negotiations, but advised by his mother Catelyn and his bannermen, made his case. He argued that the Lannisters had murdered his father unjustly, had violated every principle of honour and law. He pointed out that House Frey was sworn to House Tully, and the Tullys had called their banners in support of the North. He appealed to duty, to the obligations that bound vassal to lord, to the feudal system that was supposed to provide structure and predictability to political relationships. Walder listened to all of this with visible scepticism. Duty was all very well, he might have said, but duty didn't protect you when dragonfire was falling from the sky, or when Lannister gold was turning your allies against you. Honour was a fine thing for those who could afford it, but what exactly would honour buy his house when the Lannisters came seeking revenge? He needed something more concrete, something that would make the risk worthwhile, something that would advance House Frey's position regardless of who ultimately won the war. The negotiation continued for hours, with Walder setting terms and Robb either accepting or making counteroffers. The old Lord of the Crossing was in his element, calculating and bargaining, testing how far he could push, how much he could extract from this desperate young king, and Robb, despite his youth, understood that he had no real choice. He needed to cross. He needed Frey support. He would have to pay whatever price Walder demanded within reason, or risk his entire campaign before it had properly begun. The terms that were eventually agreed upon were substantial, the kind of concessions that would normally take years of negotiation between houses of different status. First, Robb would take one of Walder's sons as his personal squire. This was an honour that placed a Frey in the king's household, gave the family direct access to Robb and his councils, created a personal connection that could be valuable in countless ways. The squire chosen was Walder Frey, one of the more personable and capable of Walder's grandsons, someone who could represent the family well and potentially influence the young king. Second, Robb's younger sister Arya, when she was recovered, for she was missing at the time, believed to be held by the Lannisters, would be betrothed to one of Walder's sons. This was an extraordinary concession, tying the ancient and prestigious House Stark to the Freys through marriage, granting the Freys a connection they had sought for generations. The specific Frey son was to be determined later, giving Walder flexibility to choose whichever of his descendants seemed most advantageous. Third, and most importantly, Robb himself would marry one of Walder's daughters or granddaughters. Not immediately, the wedding could wait until after the war, but the commitment was binding. Robb Stark, king in the north, heir to Winterfell, would take a Frey as his queen. This was the pinnacle of everything Walder had worked toward, the ultimate validation of House Frey's worth. If a Stark king would marry a Frey, if Frey blood would run in the veins of future kings in the north, then who could say the Freys were inferior? Who could dismiss them as mere toll collectors when they were joined by marriage to the oldest and most honoured house in the north? In exchange for these concessions, Walder would allow Robb's army to cross at the Twins. More than that, he would contribute Frey forces to Robb's cause, would send his own men to fight alongside the Northmen and the Riverland lords. The numbers were substantial, nearly 4,000 Frey soldiers, a significant addition to Robb's strength. These men would be commanded by Lord Stevron, Walder's heir, ensuring that the Freys had a voice in military councils and that their interests would be represented in strategic decisions. Robb accepted these terms. What choice did he have, really? The alternative was to attempt forcing the crossing, which would be costly and time-consuming, or to take the long detour, which would give the Lannisters weeks to prepare, to consolidate their forces, to potentially defeat the Riverland armies before Robb could link up with them. The price was high, higher than what a vassal house should normally be able to demand, but the strategic situation left him little room to negotiate. The agreement was formalised with appropriate ceremony. Oaths were sworn, hands were clasped, bread and salt were shared to invoke the sacred laws of hospitality. Robb swore by the old gods, which the Starks still kept, that he would fulfil his promises. Walder swore by the Seven, the gods of the Riverlands, that he would provide the promised support. The Frey forces were mobilised, integrated into Robb's army, and the combined force crossed the bridge and continued south toward the war. The initial phases of Robb's campaign were remarkably successful. The young wolf proved to be a talented battlefield commander, winning victory after victory against Lannister forces. At the Battle of the Whispering Wood, Robb's forces ambushed and defeated a Lannister army, capturing Jaime Lannister himself, the famed Kingslayer and one of the Crown's most capable commanders. This stunning success boosted Northern and Riverland morale enormously and demonstrated that the boy king could lead, could win battles against experienced opponents. Frey forces participated in these victories. They fought at the Whispering Wood and at other engagements, contributed to the tactical successes that made Robb's reputation as a military commander. Stevron Frey commanded his men competently, coordinated with Northern and other Riverland forces, demonstrated that the Freys could be effective allies when it served their interests. The arrangement seemed to be working, seemed to be benefiting both sides. Oliver Frey served as Robb's squire faithfully and well. He was capable and personable, seemed genuinely loyal to the young king, not just performing his duties mechanically, but actually forming something like friendship with Robb. This was exactly what such arrangements were supposed to accomplish, creating personal bonds that transcended mere political calculation, building genuine relationships that would strengthen the alliance. But complications were developing, as complications always do in war. The broader strategic situation was not as favourable as Robb's tactical victories might suggest. There were not 5 kings contending for power, as the war's name would suggest. Renly Baratheon, Robert's younger brother, had declared himself king and assembled a massive army in the south. Stannis Baratheon, Robert's older brother, and by traditional succession Lors the rightful heir, had also declared himself king and was preparing his own campaign. Joffrey held King's Landing and the Iron Throne, backed by Lannister gold and power. Balon Greyjoy of the Iron Islands declared himself king and began raiding the north, taking advantage of Robb's absence to seize territory. This multiplicity of claimants created a chaotic situation where alliances shifted rapidly and long-term planning became nearly impossible. Robb was winning battles but not necessarily winning the war, was gaining territory but not securing his ultimate objectives, was impressing everyone with his tactical brilliance but struggling with the larger strategic picture. During this period, Lord Stevron Frey died of wounds received in battle. His death was a loss for the Alliance, as he had been a moderating influence. A Frey who understood honour in a more traditional sense, who had been genuinely committed to the agreement his father had made. His passing meant that the Frey forces were now commanded by others, by men who perhaps shared more of Walder's calculating pragmatism and less of Stevron's sense of obligation. Walder himself remained at the Twins, watching the war unfold, assessing how it affected his house's position. He was pleased with the initial successes, pleased that backing Robb seemed to have been the right calculation. But he was also aware that wars were not won quickly, that initial victories did not guarantee ultimate success, that the strategic situation remained fluid and dangerous. And then Robb made a choice that would change everything, that would transform the political calculation and ultimately doom not just himself, but thousands of others. Robb fell in love. He met a young woman named Jane Westerling, the daughter of a minor Westerland house, in circumstances that were complicated and emotionally charged. She nursed him after a battle wound, they spent time together, and the young king, barely 16 years old and far from home and operating under enormous pressure, found comfort and affection with her. In different circumstances, this might have been a brief affair, the kind of dalliance that young men in war often experience, regrettable perhaps, but not particularly significant in the larger scheme of things. But Robb had been raised by Eddard Stark, had internalised his father's strict code of honour, had been taught that a man of honour takes responsibility for his actions. When he slept with Jane, he felt he had dishonoured her, had taken something that honour demanded he make right. And so, in an act of what he saw as honour, but what might better be described as youthful foolishness, he married her. This marriage violated his oath to Walder Frey. Robb had sworn to marry a Frey daughter or granddaughter, had made that promise in exchange for the crossing and the Frey military support. The oath was binding, was part of a negotiated agreement, was the price he had accepted for something he desperately needed. By marrying Jane Westerling, he broke that oath, violated the terms of the alliance, dishonoured the agreement that had made his campaign possible. When news reached the Twins, when Walder learned that the young king had married someone else, that the promise of a royal marriage for a Frey girl had been broken, the old lord's rage was terrible to behold. This was exactly the kind of slight, the kind of dismissive treatment that Walder had endured his entire life. He had finally achieved something, had negotiated a marriage alliance with one of the great houses, had secured the ultimate validation of House Frey's worth. And it had been casually discarded by a boy who claimed to value honour, but who broke his oath the moment it became inconvenient. From Robb's perspective, the situation was more complicated. He had made a choice between two kinds of honour, keeping his oath to Walder or making right his dishonouring of Jane. He chose the latter, chose what he saw as the more immediate and personal obligation over the more political one. He perhaps thought that the Freys would understand, that he could offer some other compensation, that the strategic situation would force Walder to maintain the alliance regardless of this personal breach. But Robb misunderstood Walder, misunderstood what the marriage had meant to the old lord, misunderstood the depth of Frey resentment and the importance of respect to a house that had been denied it for so long. This wasn't just about a broken betrothal contract. This was about everything the contract represented, about the recognition and status that marrying into House Stark would have conferred, about the proof that the Freys were worthy of such connections. Robb attempted to make amends. He sent envoys, offered other concessions, proposed that his uncle Edmure Tully, Hoster's son and heir, marry a free girl instead. This was not nothing. Edmure would inherit Riverrun, would become the paramount lord of the Riverlands, and a marriage to him would still be valuable. But it was not what had been promised. It was a substitute, a second choice, a consolation prize. And to Walder, it confirmed what he had always suspected, that the Freys were not truly respected, that promises made to them could be broken without real consequence, that they were useful but not valued. Walder did not immediately break with Robb. That would have been straightforward, honest even, declaring the alliance void and withdrawing Frey support. Instead, he accepted the new terms, agreed that Edmure would marry his daughter Roslyn, made appropriate noises about understanding and forgiveness. He kept Frey forces in the field with Robb's army, maintained the appearance of alliance, gave no outward sign that anything fundamental had changed. But everything had changed. Walder had been offered the ultimate insult, had been shown once again that oaths to freeze could be broken, that agreements with his house were not really binding, that all his careful calculation and all his accumulated power still couldn't buy the respect he craved. And he began to calculate a different kind of response, to consider options that he might not have seriously contemplated before, to think about how he might turn the situation to his advantage while simultaneously addressing the grievance that had been done to him and to his house. At the same time, the broader strategic situation was shifting in ways that made such calculation more urgent and more dangerous. The Lannisters, after initial setbacks, were consolidating their power. Renly Baratheon had been assassinated under mysterious circumstances, and most of his army had gone over to his brother Stannis. Stannis had attempted to take King's Landing but had been defeated at the Battle of the Blackwater, his fleet destroyed and his army broken. The Lannisters had formed an alliance with House Tyrell of the Reach, the most powerful and wealthy kingdom in Westeros, creating a combined force that dwarfed anything Robb could field. Robb was still winning tactical victories but losing the strategic war. His forces were overstretched, his supply lines vulnerable, his alliances strained. The Iron Islands were ravaging the north, taking his homeland while he fought in the south. And now he had alienated his most important Riverland ally by breaking his oath, had created a situation where the Freys might reasonably question whether supporting him served their interests. Walder watched all of this, calculated all of this, and waited. He had spent 9 decades learning patience, learning to recognize when the moment was right to act. He had built his house on careful timing, on knowing when to commit and when to hold back, on understanding when calculation should give way to decisive action. And he could see that a moment was approaching, a moment when he would have to choose which side of this war to truly support, where his carefully maintained ambiguity would no longer be sustainable. The question was not whether to choose, but which choice would best serve House Frey, and what price he was willing to pay, what lines he was willing to cross to finally achieve the recognition and respect that had eluded his house for 600 years. The moment that would define House Frey for all of history, that would transform them from a wealthy but dismissed family into something far darker, approached in the autumn of the year 299 after Aegon's conquest. What happened at the Twins that autumn night was not a spontaneous act of violence, but a carefully planned operation, the result of secret negotiations and cold calculation, a decision to cross the most sacred boundary in Westerosi culture in pursuit of advancement and revenge. Let's move slowly now, let's breathe deeply, and let's try to understand how such a thing became possible, how the unthinkable became merely practical, how sacred law came to be violated in the name of pragmatism and wounded pride. The marriage of Edmure Tully to Roslyn Frey was presented as reconciliation, as Robb's way of making amends for breaking his own betrothal. Edmure was Lord Hoster's son and heir, would soon inherit Riverrun and become paramount lord of the Riverlands. A marriage to him was valuable, genuinely valuable, not the insult that Robb's broken oath had been. And so the wedding was planned, to take place at the Twins, with appropriate ceremony and celebration, with Robb and his northern lords in attendance to show their support and to honour their Tully allies. Walder accepted this arrangement, welcomed the prospect of having his daughter become Lady of Riverrun, spoke of forgiveness and renewed alliance. He invited Robb to the wedding, extended the invitation to the northern lords and their retainers, promised a feast worthy of such an occasion. The wedding would be held at the Twins, at Walder's seat, where he could ensure everything was done properly, where he could demonstrate Frey hospitality and perhaps begin to rebuild the relationship that Robb's oath-breaking had damaged. But behind this public acceptance, behind the preparations for wedding and feast, another set of plans were being laid. Walder had been approached by Tywin Lannister, or perhaps he had reached out to Tywin. The histories are not entirely clear on who initiated contact. What matters is that conversations took place, secret negotiations conducted through intermediaries, discussions about what might be possible if the Freys were willing to change sides, to betray their alliance with Robb Stark and support the Iron Throne instead. Tywin's offer was substantial, carefully calibrated to address everything the Freys had always wanted. If Walder would help eliminate Robb Stark and his northern lords, would help break the rebellion in the northern Riverlands, he would receive rewards beyond what any amount of loyal service had ever earned him. The Freys would be granted Riverrun itself, would replace the Tullys as the paramount house of the Riverlands. Younger sons would receive castles and lands. The family would be formally legitimised in ways that 600 years of wealth accumulation had never achieved. They would have not just power but recognised status, not just wealth but honour, or at least the outward trappings of honour that Westeros respected. More subtly, but perhaps more importantly, Tywin offered validation. The Lannisters were the richest and most powerful house in Westeros, the family that controlled the Iron Throne, the ultimate arbiters of status and legitimacy in the Seven Kingdoms. If the Lannisters treated the Freys as equals, as valued allies worthy of great rewards, then who could say otherwise? The stigma of being toll collectors, the taint of commercial wealth, the dismissive attitudes of the older houses, all of that could be washed away by Lannister gold and Lannister approval. The price for all of this was terrible, unprecedented really. Walder would have to violate guest right, would have to murder people who had eaten his bread and salt, who had accepted his hospitality and were therefore under his protection. Guest right was one of the most sacred laws in Westeros, older than the Seven, older than written history. A fundamental principle that made civilization possible. A guest in your home was inviolable. To harm them was to violate the most basic trust that allowed people to negotiate, to trade, to interact across hostile boundaries. Guest right had been respected even in the darkest periods of Westerosi history, even by the most ruthless and cruel rulers, because everyone understood that some lines could not be crossed without destroying the foundations of social order itself. But Walder was 90 years old and bitter, had spent his entire long life being disrespected despite his wealth and power, had just been personally insulted by having a sworn oath broken, had watched the strategic situation shift in ways that suggested Robb would ultimately lose the war. He calculated, as he had always calculated, weighing the practical benefits against the moral costs, assessing whether the violation of sacred law was worth what it would purchase. From a purely pragmatic standpoint, the calculation made a kind of terrible sense. Guest right was important, certainly, but it was also just a convention, a social agreement that persisted because people chose to respect it. If Walder violated it, yes, he would be condemned, but he would also be powerful, would have Lannister backing, would finally have the status his house had always deserved. The condemnation of other houses would matter less if those houses needed him, if he controlled the Riverlands with Lannister support, if his wealth and power were too great to be easily challenged. And there was the element of revenge, of finally responding to a lifetime of slights and dismissals with something more than patient calculation. Robb had broken his oath, had insulted House Frey in the most personal way possible. The other northern lords had come to the Twins, had accepted Frey hospitality and Frey support, but they had never truly respected the Freys, had always treated them as useful but inferior. Here was an opportunity to show them all that the Freys were not to be dismissed, that breaking oaths to House Frey had consequences, that underestimating Walder was a fatal mistake. The planning was meticulous. The wedding itself would be genuine. Roslin would truly marry Edmure, and by all accounts she knew nothing of what was to follow, was an innocent participant in a ceremony that would become a massacre. The feast would proceed normally until a certain point, until a specific signal. Musicians had been hired. Not just any musicians, but particular men who could be trusted to do what was necessary when the moment came. Frey soldiers were positioned throughout the castle, armed and ready, but not obviously so, prepared to seal exits and overwhelm the northern forces when the signal was given. Roose Bolton, one of Robb's bannermen, was also involved in the conspiracy. Bolton was Lord of the Dreadfort, an ancient northern house with a dark reputation, and he had his own reasons for wanting to betray Robb. The exact nature of his arrangement with the Lannisters is not entirely clear, but he would be rewarded with the North itself, would become Warden of the North in place of the Starks. His forces, which were supposed to be part of Robb's army, would instead help carry out the massacre, would ensure that the Northern Lords were surrounded and helpless when the trap was sprung. The wedding day arrived. It was late autumn, the leaves turning colours, a chill in the air that suggested winter was approaching. Robb arrived at the Twins with his mother Catelyn, with his pregnant wife Jane, though she would be left behind for safety. With his northern lords and their retainers, they came in peace, came to celebrate a wedding and to reinforce their alliance with the Freys. They were welcomed with appropriate ceremony, were given bread and salt in accordance with the ancient customs, were thereby placed under guest rights protection. The wedding ceremony itself was conducted by a septon in the sept at the Twins. Edmure and Roslin exchanged vows, were joined in marriage before the Seven, began a union that should have lasted a lifetime. Roslin was reportedly beautiful and seemed genuinely nervous, played her part perfectly whether she knew it was a part or truly was the innocent bride she appeared to be. Edmure seemed pleased with the match, relieved that the Freys had accepted this arrangement, hopeful that the alliance was mending. The feast followed the ceremony, held in the great hall of the Twins. It was magnificent by all accounts, the kind of celebration that demonstrated Frey wealth and capability. Long tables groaned under the weight of food and drink, every delicacy that the Riverlands could provide, wine flowing freely, musicians playing, the great hall decorated appropriately for a celebration. Robb and his lords were seated in positions of honour, were treated as valued guests, were given no reason to suspect that anything was wrong. The feast progressed through its early courses. Toasts were made, songs were sung, the traditional bawdy humour of bedding ceremonies was employed to much laughter. Edmure and Roslin were eventually escorted from the hall to consummate their marriage, a normal part of noble wedding celebrations. The Northern Lords relaxed, drank wine, enjoyed the food and the music, let their guard down in what they believed was a safe space, protected by guest right and by their alliance with the Freys. And then the music changed. The musicians who had been playing cheerful wedding songs began a different tune. The Rains of Castamere, the Lannister song, a melody about the destruction of House Rain by Tywin Lannister, about what happened to those who defied Casterly Rock. It was a message, a signal, a moment when everything shifted from celebration to horror. The doors to the Great Hall were barred. Frey soldiers appeared, armed with crossbows blocking the exits. Robb and his lords understood immediately that something was terribly wrong, reached for weapons that weren't there, having come to a wedding feast rather than a battle. Catelyn Stark, Robb's mother, grabbed a knife and held it to the throat of Walder's wife, threatened to kill her if the Freys didn't stop, tried desperately to find some leverage, some way to prevent what was about to happen. But Walder, speaking from his seat overlooking the hall, made clear that threats were useless. He had many wives, had outlived most of them already, and one more death meant nothing to him compared to what he was about to gain. The massacre began. Crossbow bolts flew into the Northern Lords, cutting them down where they sat or stood. Robb was struck multiple times, wounded but not immediately killed. His direwolf Grey Wind, who had been kennelled away from the feast, could be heard howling in rage and fear before being killed by Frey soldiers. Outside the castle, the Northern army was also being slaughtered. Bolton forces and Frey soldiers attacked the northern camp, killed men who were unprepared for battle, who had thought they were among allies, who were cut down before they could organise any meaningful defence. It was methodical, efficient, the kind of military operation that required careful planning and coordination, the kind of thing that couldn't happen by accident or in the heat of the moment. Back in the hall, Catelyn watched her son die. She had already lost her husband Eddard, had already endured so much grief and horror, and now she was watching the destruction of everything she had tried to protect. In her final moments, she kept her promise, cut the throat of Walder's wife. A futile gesture of defiance and revenge. Then she too was killed, her throat cut, her body left among the dead in the hall. The Northern Lords died almost to a man. The small John Umber, Lord Karstark's sons, Dacey Mormont, dozens of others, all slaughtered in what should have been a safe space, all murdered under the protection of guest right. The few who survived did so by chance or by fleeing quickly enough to escape the initial slaughter, hiding among the bodies or finding some way out of the sealed hall. But these were exceptions. The plan was thorough, and its execution was effective. Robb Stark, King in the North, died at the age of 16. Having ruled for less than 2 years, having won every battle but lost the war, his body was mutilated after death, his head removed and replaced with that of his direwolf Grey Wind, a final insult, a desecration meant to mock and humiliate even in death. This abomination was displayed publicly, a message to anyone who might think of rebelling against the Iron Throne or dishonouring their agreements with House Frey. The event would become known as the Red Wedding, and it would be remembered as one of the most shocking atrocities in Westerosi history, not because the death toll was particularly high by the standards of warfare, many battles had killed more people, but because of how it was accomplished, through the violation of sacred law, through the betrayal of trust and hospitality, through the breaking of customs so fundamental that they were thought to be inviolable. From Walder's perspective, it was a successful operation. He had eliminated a political problem, had changed sides to the winning faction at the crucial moment, had demonstrated that House Frey was not to be trifled with. The immediate rewards were substantial. The Lannisters kept their promises, granted the Freys their rewards, elevated them in status and gave them lands and castles. Walder's sons and grandsons received positions and titles. The family was formally legitimised, recognised as loyal servants of the crown, valued allies of the most powerful house in Westeros. But the cost, the hidden cost that wouldn't become fully apparent for some time, was also substantial. Walder had violated guest right, had crossed a line that even the most ruthless lords had historically respected. He had done it openly, had made no attempt to disguise what had happened, or to maintain any fiction that the deaths were accidental. Everyone would know that the Freys had massacred guests, had murdered people under their protection, had violated the most sacred laws of hospitality for political gain. This would have consequences, immediate and long-term, practical and spiritual. The concept of guest right existed for a reason. It made negotiation possible, made it possible for enemies to meet and talk without fear of assassination, made it possible to conduct the ordinary business of feudal politics. By violating it so blatantly, Walder had damaged not just his own reputation, but the entire system of trust that allowed Westerosi society to function. If guest right could be violated when it was convenient, if sacred oaths could be broken for political advantage, then what was safe? What promise could be trusted? What gathering could be assumed to be protected? The immediate aftermath at the Twins was grim. The bodies had to be disposed of. Hundreds of northern soldiers and lords, all killed on Frey lands under Frey hospitality. The Great Hall had to be cleaned of blood. The evidence of massacre scrubbed away as if that could scrub away the guilt or the memory. Edmure Tully, who had consummated his marriage while his nephew and his nephew's supporters were being slaughtered, was taken prisoner, his marriage transformed from a celebration into a trap. Roslyn, whether she had known or not, was now tied to House Frey's crime, her wedding night forever associated with mass murder. Walder himself seemed unbothered by the moral weight of what he had done. He had made a calculation and executed it, had achieved his objectives and secured his rewards. The condemnation of other houses, the horror and disgust that would be directed at the Freys, all of that was merely the price of doing business, the cost of finally achieving the recognition and power his house deserved. He had lived 90 years without the respect of his peers, and if violating guest right was what it took to finally command that respect, or at least to command fear, which was often more useful than respect, then so be it. But the old lord, for all his calculation, may have miscalculated the depth of the reaction, the way that this event would transform not just how others saw the Freys, but how they saw themselves. Some Freys, those who participated willingly, or who supported the decision, would rationalize it as necessary, as the hard choice that weak men couldn't make, as pragmatism triumphing over sentiment. Others, particularly the younger Freys who had formed genuine relationships with the northern lords, who had served as Robb's squire or fought alongside northern forces, would be horrified, would feel implicated in a crime they wanted no part of, would carry guilt and shame for something their grandfather had ordered, but that would stain the entire family. The Red Wedding was over in a few hours, but its consequences would echo for years, for generations, perhaps for as long as anyone remembered House Frey at all. Walder had achieved what he wanted, had finally forced the realm to acknowledge his house's importance, had secured rewards that 600 years of patient accumulation had never delivered. But he had done so by becoming exactly what the other houses had always suspected the Freys were: pragmatists without honour, calculators without conscience, people who would do anything, cross any line, violate any sacred law, if the price was right and the reward sufficient. The late Lord Frey had finally arrived, but he had arrived bearing blood and treachery, and neither he nor his house would ever escape the shadow of that terrible autumn night at the Twins. The morning after the Red Wedding, the sun rose over the Twins as it always had, indifferent to what had transpired beneath its light. The Green Fork flowed on, carrying away nothing of the night's horror. The bridge stood as it had for 600 years, and the twin castles remained solid and imposing. But everything had changed, in ways that would become clearer with each passing day, each passing week, as the consequences of violating sacred law spread outward like ripples from a stone thrown into still water. Let's slow down now, let's breathe, and let's explore what happened after, how a poisoned victory became something far worse, how House Frey discovered that some prices cannot be calculated in advance. The immediate rewards came quickly, as Tywin Lannister had promised. Royal decrees arrived from King's Landing bearing the seal of King Joffrey and the authority of the Iron Throne. Walder Frey and his descendants were granted Riverrun, the ancient seat of House Tully, along with lordship over the Riverlands. Various Frey sons and grandsons received castles and lands that had belonged to houses that supported Robb Stark, rewards carved from the territories of the defeated. The family's status was formally elevated, their service to the crown publicly praised, their loyalty rewarded in ways that were tangible and substantial. Emmon Frey, married to Jenna Lannister, was granted Riverrun itself, would become the new Lord of Riverrun once the castle was taken from the Tully forces that still held it. This was an extraordinary elevation for a younger son of a vassal house. A leap in status that would normally take generations to achieve. Black Walder and others received smaller keeps and territories, positions of command and authority that enhanced both their personal power and the family's collective strength. The Freys were, on paper at least, one of the great houses of Westeros now, paramount in the Riverlands, allied with the crown, wealthy and powerful and formally recognised. But the other reward, the one Walder had perhaps sought even more than territory or titles, proved elusive from the very beginning. Respect, recognition as equals by the other great houses, acceptance into the higher circles of Westerosi nobility. These things did not come with the royal decrees, could not be granted by Lannister authority, depended on something more intangible than land grants or formal positions. The first indication that something was wrong came in how the Red Wedding was discussed, or rather, how it wasn't discussed. In the immediate aftermath, the Crown's official position was that justice had been done, that traitors had been punished, that the Freys had performed loyal service by helping to end a dangerous rebellion. But even in King's Landing, even among those who benefited from the outcome, there was a certain unease, a reluctance to praise too loudly, or to celebrate too openly what had been accomplished. The violation of guest right was too blatant to ignore or explain away. Even those who supported the Lannisters, who were glad to see Robb Stark dead and the Northern Rebellion broken, were troubled by the method. Guest right was fundamental, was one of the pillars that made civilized interaction possible in a violent world. If it could be violated so casually, if sacred law could be broken for political convenience, then nothing was safe, no negotiation could be trusted, no meeting could be assumed to be protected. Throughout the realm, the reaction was one of shock and horror. In the north, the news of the Red Wedding created grief and rage in equal measure. The northern lords had lost their king, had lost fathers and sons and brothers to Frey treachery. The common people, who had supported Robb's cause and believed in the justice of his rebellion, were devastated. The Starks had ruled the north for thousands of years, had commanded fierce loyalty through generally just and honourable governance, and now they had been betrayed and slaughtered by people who had eaten their bread and salt. In the Riverlands, the reaction was more complex. Some houses, those that had supported the crown or remained neutral, were relieved that the war was over, that they could stop fighting and try to recover from years of devastation. But even these houses were troubled by the method of victory, by the fact that one of their own, a Riverland house, had committed such an atrocity. Other houses, those that had supported the Tullys and the Starks, were outraged and grieving, their lords and heirs dead at the Twins, their loyalty rewarded with massacre. House Blackwood and House Bracken, those ancient enemies who agreed on almost nothing, both condemned the Red Wedding. The Mallisters of Seaguard, who had fought alongside Robb, were horrified. Throughout the Riverlands, the name Frey became associated with treachery and dishonour, became a byword for everything that was wrong with those who valued power over principle, wealth over honour, pragmatism over sacred law. The mockery began almost immediately. Mayhaps, a word that Walder had used repeatedly during his negotiations with Robb, became a cruel joke. When a Frey made a promise or stated an intention, people would respond with mayhaps, suggesting that Frey words were worthless, that their oaths meant nothing, that they could be trusted only to do whatever served their immediate interests. It was a small thing, a verbal tick turned into an insult, but it spread throughout Westeros and stuck to the family like pitch. The late Lord Frey nickname, which had once been merely mocking, took on darker connotations. Now it suggested not just caution or cowardice, but calculation of the most ruthless kind, a willingness to arrive at precisely the moment when betrayal would be most effective. Walder had been late to battles, but right on time for massacres, the joke went, and the laughter that accompanies such jests was bitter rather than amused. More seriously, the Freys began to die, not in battle, not in the ordinary course of events, but specifically, deliberately, killed in revenge for the Red Wedding. The perpetrators were various. Some were northern soldiers who had survived the massacre and now sought vengeance against any Frey they could find. Some were Riverland small folk who blamed the Freys for bringing more war and suffering to their already devastated lands. Some were members of the Brotherhood Without Banners, an outlaw group that had been fighting for small folk rights and against the depredations of the war. Remund Frey, Stevron's son who should have inherited after his father, but who had proven incompetent and unreliable, was hanged by outlaws while travelling between castles. The hanging was public, meant to send a message, and Remund's body was left swinging from a tree as a warning and a promise. Other Freys were killed in their beds, or ambushed on roads, or murdered in taverns, each death a small act of revenge for the greater crime of the Red Wedding. The Brotherhood Without Banners became particularly effective at hunting Freys. The Brotherhood had originally been formed under the authority of Eddard Stark to fight Lannister forces ravaging the Riverlands, but after Eddard's death they had continued as outlaws, protecting the small folk and punishing those who preyed on them. After the Red Wedding they added a new purpose: vengeance against House Frey. They hunted Freys systematically, captured them when possible, and executed them after trials that were perfunctory, but at least maintained some fiction of justice. The leader of this campaign of revenge was someone who called herself Lady Stoneheart, though that was not a name anyone in Westeros would have recognised. The truth was more horrifying. Lady Stoneheart was Catelyn Stark, or what remained of her. Her body had been thrown into the river after the Red Wedding, but she had been pulled out days later and resurrected by a Red Priest of R'hllor named Thoros of Myr. The resurrection had not been clean, had not restored her fully to life, had instead created something twisted and single-minded, a creature driven entirely by hatred and the desire for vengeance. Catelyn, or Stoneheart as she now was, remembered the Red Wedding. She remembered watching her son die, remembered cutting the throat of Walder's wife, remembered her own death, and she dedicated what remained of her existence to making the Freys pay. Under her leadership, the Brotherhood hunted Freys with methodical determination, giving them trials that were formalities before execution, hanging them or cutting their throats, leaving their bodies displayed as warnings. This campaign of revenge created a climate of fear among the Freys. Travelling became dangerous, leaving the twins became a risk. Every shadow might hide an assassin, every stranger might be Brotherhood. The family that had seemed so secure in their new power discovered that power couldn't protect against determined individuals willing to die for revenge. That all their soldiers and castles couldn't prevent dedicated enemies from finding isolated targets. Within the family itself, fractures began to appear. The Freys had never been truly united, had always been held together primarily by Walder's iron control and by their common interest in advancing the family's position. But the Red Wedding created divisions that couldn't be papered over. Some Freys, particularly those who had participated willingly or who shared Walder's pragmatic approach to honour, defended the decision as necessary, as the hard choice that weak men couldn't make. They argued that Robb had broken his oath first, that the Freys had simply responded to betrayal with betrayal, that in war you did what was necessary to win. Others, particularly among the younger generation who had served with Robb or fought alongside northern forces, were horrified by what their grandfather had done. Olyvar Frey, who had been Robb's squire and had genuinely befriended the young king, was devastated. He had been kept away from the twins during the wedding, had not participated in the massacre, but he was still a Frey and thus implicated in the crime. His relationship with Robb had been real, his service had been genuine, and now he carried the guilt of his family's betrayal, even though he had played no part in planning or executing it. Perwyn Frey and others like him found themselves in an impossible position. They were Freys, carried the name and the blood, benefited from the family's new status and wealth, but they were also individuals with their own consciences and their own understanding of honour. They couldn't simply disown their family, couldn't wash away the stain of being a Frey, but neither could they fully accept or justify what had been done in the family's name. These internal divisions created tension that Walder struggled to manage. His usual method of maintaining control, playing family members against each other and keeping everyone competing for his favour, became more difficult when the competition was overlaid with genuine moral disagreement about fundamental questions of honour and acceptable behaviour. Some family members became more ruthless, more willing to embrace the pragmatic amorality that the Red Wedding represented, seeing it as liberation from the constraints of honour that had always disadvantaged the Freys. Others became more troubled, more conscious of the price they were paying for advancement, more aware that some victories were too costly regardless of what they purchased. The occupation of Riverrun, which should have been a triumph, became a source of ongoing problems. The castle was still held by Tully loyalists, by men who remembered their oaths and who refused to simply hand over their ancestral seat to the family that had massacred their allies. The siege of Riverrun dragged on, tying down Frey forces and resources, creating a visible reminder that the Lannisters' promises of reward were easier to make than to fulfill. When Riverrun finally fell, when Aemon Frey finally took possession of the castle that was supposed to be his prize, he discovered that ruling the Riverlands was far more difficult than he had anticipated. The Riverland houses that were supposed to be his vassals resented him, obeyed grudgingly when they obeyed at all, looked for any opportunity to undermine or resist Frey authority. The small folk remembered that the Freys had brought them more war, more death, more suffering, and they showed their resentment in countless small ways, through non-cooperation and passive resistance and occasional acts of violence. The Freys had won the Riverlands on paper, had been granted authority by the Iron Throne, but they struggled to actually govern. To transform formal authority into effective power, they had to maintain large garrisons, had to constantly watch for rebellion or resistance, had to spend gold and effort on occupation that drained the resources they had hoped to gain. The Riverlands became less a prize than a burden, less a source of new wealth than a sink for existing resources. The paranoia that gripped the family affected everyone differently. Walder himself seemed unbothered. Or at least he showed no outward sign of concern. He had made his calculation and accepted the consequences, and if some of his descendants were killed in revenge, well, he had so many descendants that a few deaths hardly mattered. He remained at the Twins, continued to manage his household and his tolls, continued to make decisions about family strategy and deployment, continued to be the Lord of the Crossing indeed, even as his formal titles expanded to include lordship over the Riverlands. But the younger Freys, those who had to travel and fight and govern, lived with constant fear. Every meal might be poisoned, every servant might be an assassin, every dark road might hide enemies waiting in ambush. The psychological cost of the Red Wedding, the price paid in stress and fear and constant vigilance, was harder to measure than the formal rewards, but perhaps more significant in the long run. The family's reputation, which they had hoped to improve through their bold action, instead became irreparably stained. The Freys were now known throughout Westeros as oath-breakers, as violators of guest right, as people who could not be trusted under any circumstances. Other houses that needed to interact with them did so with extreme caution, with explicit guarantees and hostages and precautions that acknowledged the fundamental untrustworthiness that the Red Wedding had demonstrated. This reputation made alliances more difficult to form and maintain. Who would trust a Frey promise after what had happened at the wedding? Who would accept Frey hospitality without fear? Who would marry into a family so stained by dishonour? The Freys had wealth and power, but they were isolated in ways that wealth and power couldn't address, cut off from the normal networks of trust and reciprocity that made feudal society function. Even their Lannister allies, who had encouraged and rewarded the Red Wedding, treated them with a certain disdain. The Lannisters had used the Freys, had recognised that Walder's resentment and ambition made him willing to do what others would not, had exploited that willingness for their own purposes. But having used the Freys, having benefited from their willingness to violate sacred law, the Lannisters also despised them for being the kind of people who would do such a thing. It was hypocrisy of a particularly cynical kind, condemning others for doing what you encouraged them to do, but it was also characteristic of how the Freys were viewed even by their supposed allies. The younger Freys who'd wanted no part in the Red Wedding found themselves trapped. They couldn't escape their family name, couldn't wash away the stain of being a Frey. Some tried to distinguish themselves, to demonstrate through their actions that they were different, that they maintained honour even if their family did not. But these efforts were largely futile. The world had decided what Freys were, had written the whole family into a single narrative of treachery and dishonour, and individual exceptions were overlooked or dismissed. The strategic situation that had seemed so favourable immediately after the Red Wedding began to deteriorate in other ways as well. The North remained unconquered, the Ironborn occupation created ongoing resistance, and the Crown's hold over the region was tenuous at best. The Riverlands were pacified in the sense that open warfare had ceased, but they were not peaceful, not stable, not genuinely under control. The victory that the Red Wedding had supposedly secured proved to be incomplete and fragile, requiring constant effort and vigilance to maintain. Walder had calculated that the rewards would outweigh the costs, that formal status and Lannister backing would more than compensate for any reputation damage or moral qualms, but as the months passed, as Freys continued to die in revenge killings, as the isolation and fear became the family's daily reality, as the promised rewards proved harder to enjoy than to receive, the calculation began to look different. Perhaps the old lord had been right and the price was worth paying. Or perhaps he had miscalculated in ways that wouldn't become fully apparent until after his death, when the family would have to navigate the world without his iron control, carrying the burden of what he had done, but lacking his ruthless pragmatism about accepting the consequences. The Red Wedding had achieved its immediate objectives. Robb Stark was dead, the Northern Rebellion was broken, the Freys had been elevated and rewarded. But the aftermath revealed that some victories create their own problems, that crossing certain lines changes you in ways that cannot be undone, that there are prices that cannot be calculated in advance because they compound over time, growing heavier with each passing year. The Freys had finally forced the realm to pay attention to them, had finally demonstrated that they could not be dismissed or ignored, but the attention they received was not respect or honour or genuine acceptance. It was fear mixed with contempt, usefulness tainted by revulsion, power undermined by the universal knowledge that their word was worthless and their hospitality was a trap. They had won, in a sense, but it was the kind of victory that destroys the victor, that grants advancement at the cost of everything that makes advancement worth having. If you're finding these contemplative explorations of Westerosi history and politics a peaceful way to end your day, a like and subscribe really helps others discover these gentle journeys through the past. And to those already subscribed, thank you for being part of this community of those who find comfort in slowly unfolding stories of power and patience, of roses growing strong through centuries of careful cultivation. As we approach the end of our long journey through Frey history, it's worth pausing to reflect on what this family represents, what their story tells us about power and honour, about ambition and consequence, about the choices people make and the prices they pay. House Frey is not simply a cautionary tale about the dangers of treachery, though it is certainly that. It's something more complex, more human, a story about the gap between achievement and recognition, about what happens when pragmatism becomes untethered from principle, about the terrible clarity that comes from wanting something so badly that you're willing to destroy everything to get it. So let's settle in now, let's breathe slowly, and let's contemplate what 600 years of building and one night of betrayal can teach us about the nature of power itself. House Frey's story begins with ambition, with vision, with someone looking at a river and seeing not an obstacle but an opportunity. There's something admirable in that, something quintessentially human about the desire to build, to create, to leave something that will outlast you. The founder of House Frey risked everything on a bridge that wouldn't be completed in his lifetime, that might never pay off, that required generations of sustained effort and commitment. That's not the act of a small-minded person or a purely selfish one. That's the act of someone who could think beyond their own lifespan, who could envision something larger than themselves, and the bridge was built. Against enormous odds, despite the technical challenges and the financial risks and the political complications, the Freys built their bridge, and it stood. It stands still 600 years later, carrying countless travellers across the Green Fork, facilitating trade and communication and movement throughout the Riverlands. It is, by any measure, a remarkable achievement, the kind of thing that should earn genuine respect and admiration. The Freys built something that made the world better, that solved a real problem, that benefited everyone who used it. But they were never given the credit they deserved for this achievement. The bridge was too commercial, the tolls were too obviously about money, the whole enterprise was too practical and not romantic enough for the aristocratic culture of Westeros. And this denial of recognition, this gap between what they accomplished and what they were granted, created a wound in the family's collective psyche that never healed, that festered over generations, that ultimately led them to make choices that destroyed everything they had built. There's tragedy in this, real tragedy in the classical sense. The Freys weren't evil from the beginning. They were pragmatic, yes, calculating certainly, but these qualities aren't inherently bad. Pragmatism means understanding reality as it is rather than as you wish it were. Calculation means thinking carefully about consequences before acting. These can be virtues when balanced with other values, when tempered by principle or constrained by honour. But when pragmatism becomes the only value, when calculation is unmoored from any consideration beyond immediate advantage, then these virtues curdle into something darker. The Freys learned over 600 years that honour wouldn't protect you, that noble lineage was meaningless without power to back it up, that the respect of other houses was pleasant to have but not essential for survival or success. These lessons weren't wrong exactly. Honour alone doesn't win wars, ancient bloodlines don't feed armies, and respect without power is just empty flattery. The Freys were right about the practical realities of power in Westeros, right that wealth and military strength mattered more than whether other nobles considered you respectable. But they forgot, or never learned, or deliberately rejected the truth that power without legitimacy is unstable, that wealth without respect creates isolation, that strength without honour makes enemies of everyone who has to deal with you. They optimise for the wrong things, maximised the variables they could measure while ignoring the intangibles that ultimately mattered more. It's a mistake that individuals and institutions make repeatedly throughout history, confusing what can be counted with what counts, mistaking the map for the territory, forgetting that some of the most important things in life resist quantification. The resentment that built up over those 600 years was understandable, even justified in some ways. The Freys were treated poorly by houses that were objectively less powerful and wealthy. They were looked down on for the source of their wealth, when other houses had equally sordid origins if you looked back far enough in their histories. They were excluded from social circles despite having everything that supposedly qualified you for membership. The snobbery they faced was real, the prejudice was genuine, and their anger about being dismissed was reasonable. But resentment, however justified, is poison if you let it drive your decisions. It narrows your vision, makes you focus on grievances rather than opportunities, leads you to value revenge over advancement. Walder Frey spent 90 years nursing grudges, remembering slights, keeping score of every instance where he felt his house wasn't given proper respect. And when the opportunity finally came to address all of those grievances simultaneously, to force recognition from a realm that had denied it for so long, he couldn't resist the temptation even though it required crossing the most sacred boundary in his society. The Red Wedding was not an aberration in Frey history but its culmination, the logical endpoint of 600 years of pragmatism divorced from principle. Every generation that chose calculation over honour, every decision that prioritised advancement over relationship, every time a Frey lord decided that oaths were just words and promises were negotiable, All of it led to that night at the Twins when sacred law was violated in pursuit of status and revenge. It was, in a terrible way, the most Frey thing the Freys could have done, the ultimate expression of their house's character and values. But it was also a profound miscalculation, perhaps the greatest miscalculation in their long history of careful accounting. Walder believed that power and Lannister backing would be enough, that formal status would eventually translate into genuine respect, that the condemnation of other houses would matter less than the rewards he received. He was wrong about all of this, wrong in ways that became clear almost immediately, and would become more clear as time went on. The violation of guest right was a line that once crossed changed everything. Guest right existed for reasons that Walder either didn't understand or didn't care about. It wasn't just a nice tradition, or an arbitrary rule, it was fundamental infrastructure for a feudal society, the foundation that made negotiation and diplomacy and peaceful interaction possible between often hostile parties. When the Freys violated it, they didn't just break a rule, they damaged the system itself, made it harder for everyone to trust anyone, created a precedent that would haunt Westeros long after House Frey was gone. And what did they gain? Formal titles and lands that they struggled to actually govern, wealth they already had, status that no one genuinely granted them regardless of what documents said. They were more powerful after the Red Wedding but less secure, more prominent but more isolated, more feared but less respected than ever. The calculation had failed on its own terms, had purchased nothing of lasting value at the price of everything that might have made that value worth having. There's a question worth contemplating here, about whether honour and principle are luxuries that only the secure can afford, or whether they're necessities that everyone needs for long-term survival. The Freys believed the former, believed that honour was for people who didn't need to fight for every scrap of recognition, that those who were still climbing couldn't afford to be constrained by rules that disadvantaged them. But their fate suggests the latter, suggests that honour and principle aren't optional extras but essential elements of sustainable power, that short-term gains from violating them are always outweighed by long-term costs. The tragedy of House Frey is that they had almost everything they needed to achieve what they wanted. They had wealth, power, strategic position, a massive extended family creating connections throughout Westeros. They had demonstrated capability and persistence. They had built something genuinely impressive and useful. What they lacked was patience for one more generation, willingness to keep playing the long game they had played successfully for centuries, the wisdom to recognise that some shortcuts lead nowhere worth going. If Walder had simply accepted the broken betrothal, if he had taken Edmure Tully's marriage as a reasonable compensation, if he had continued supporting Robb Stark or at least remained neutral, House Frey would still be standing as it had stood for 600 years. They would still be wealthy and powerful and essential. The next generation might have seen their status improve further through marriage alliances and continued service. The respect they craved might have come gradually, organically, as other houses found themselves needing Frey cooperation and learning to value it. But Walder couldn't wait, couldn't accept one more slight, couldn't let the insult of Robb's broken oath go unanswered, and in seeking immediate redress for that grievance, in choosing the quick path to recognition over the slow accumulation that had served his family for so long, he destroyed everything. The Red Wedding gave House Frey exactly what Walder asked for: attention, fear, undeniable importance, but it also gave them isolation, condemnation, and a stain that would never wash away. The story also reveals something about the nature of respect and how it's earned or lost. Respect cannot be compelled or purchased, cannot be granted by decree or secured through threats. It emerges from consistent behaviour over time, from demonstrated reliability and proven character, from the slow accumulation of evidence that someone's word can be trusted and their commitments are genuine. The Freys wanted respect without the behaviour that earns it, wanted to be treated as honourable without actually being honourable, wanted the rewards of virtue without the constraints it imposes. This is perhaps a particularly modern temptation, though it has always existed in some form. We live in a time when image often matters more than substance, when branding can substitute for quality, when the appearance of success is sometimes valued more than actual achievement. The Freys were ahead of their time in understanding that perception matters, that how you're seen affects what you can accomplish. But they were wrong in believing that perception could be entirely divorced from reality, that you could be seen as honourable while acting dishonourably, and have that perception persist once people understood what you actually were. The younger Freys, those who inherited the consequences of decisions they didn't make, represent another dimension of the tragedy. Walder Frey genuinely served Robb Stark, formed real friendships, maintained actual honour in his conduct, but he was still a Frey, still implicated in his family's crimes, still carried a name that had become synonymous with treachery. The unfairness of this collective guilt is real. The way that family ties bind you to crimes you didn't commit and wouldn't have approved is genuinely tragic. But it's also how the world works, how reputation functions, how families and institutions are judged. When an organisation or a family or a nation commits atrocities, everyone associated with it carries some of the weight, fairly or not. The only real options are to work to change the organisation from within, to publicly disavow it and accept the costs of that disavowal, or to leave and start fresh somewhere else. The younger Freys who wanted to maintain honour while keeping their family name and its advantages were trying to have it both ways, and the world wouldn't let them. There's also something to contemplate about the role of time and patience in human affairs. The Freys played a long game successfully for 6 centuries. They built slowly, accumulated steadily, made incremental progress across generations. This patience was, in many ways, their greatest strength. The quality that allowed them to succeed despite starting from a relatively modest position. But at the crucial moment, that patience failed. Walder couldn't wait one more generation, couldn't accept that his house's advancement might be completed by his successors rather than by him. This failure of patience at the critical moment is characteristic of how power corrupts and ambition blinds. When you've spent your entire life working toward a goal, when you can see it almost within reach, the temptation to grasp it immediately rather than waiting becomes almost overwhelming. Walder had lived 90 years without the respect he craved. He could see an opportunity to seize it, and he couldn't bear the thought of dying without having achieved it, of leaving the final step to his heirs. So he reached for it in the only way that seemed immediately available, and in doing so destroyed what 600 years of patience had built. The counterfactual is worth considering. What if Robb had kept his oath? What if he had married a Frey girl as promised? If Walder had gotten the recognition he craved through alliance rather than through betrayal, would the Freys have been satisfied? Would their long climb toward respect have been complete? Would they have finally felt they had achieved what they deserved? Or would it have proven insufficient? Would new grievances have emerged? Would the fundamental insecurity and resentment have found new targets? We can't know for certain. But the history suggests that Walder's hunger for respect was probably unsatisfiable, that no amount of external validation would have addressed the internal wound of feeling looked down upon. This is often the case with resentment and status anxiety. The problem is internal, psychological, about how you see yourself and your worth. External recognition can't fix that, because there's always another slight to notice, another instance of insufficient respect to resent, another way in which you're being treated as less than you deserve. House Frey ultimately represents the hollowness of power without purpose, of success without meaning, of achievement measured purely in material terms. They built a bridge, accumulated wealth, fielded armies, expanded their family, gained formal status. By every measurable metric they succeeded. But they never figured out why they were doing any of it beyond the simple fact that they could, beyond the desire to prove they were as good as houses they resented. And that lack of deeper purpose, That absence of any principle or value beyond advancement itself left them vulnerable to the ultimate corruption of choosing expedience over honour when the choice mattered most. The legacy they left is cautionary but also human, comprehensible even when it's condemnable. Most people understand the desire for recognition, the pain of being dismissed or looked down on, the temptation to cut corners when the straight path seems too long or too difficult. The Freys took these universal human impulses to their logical extreme, showed us where they lead when unconstrained by principle or tempered by wisdom. They showed us that some victories aren't worth their cost, that some prices are too high regardless of what they purchase, that crossing certain lines changes you in ways you can't anticipate and can't reverse. In the end, House Frey built something remarkable and destroyed it themselves, achieved great success and rendered it meaningless, spent 600 years climbing toward a goal, and then discovered that reaching it through betrayal made it worthless. They proved that you could be wealthy and powerful and formally recognized and still be despised, that you could win every practical advantage and still lose everything that matters. That calculation without conscience leads inevitably to choices that destroy the calculator. The bridge still stands, that achievement remains, but it's shadowed now by what its builders became, by the terrible lesson their ambition teaches about the corruption of power and the emptiness of success divorced from honour. Their story is tragic and instructive, a reminder that how you climb matters as much as whether you reach the summit. That some paths to success lead only to discovering that success itself was never really what you needed. And so we come to the end of our journey across the Green Fork, our slow drift through 600 years of building and one night of ruin. We've walked together through the halls of the twins, listened to the river flowing beneath that remarkable bridge, watched generations of Freys accumulate wealth and power and resentment, witnessed how ambition without honour leads always to the same dark place. It's been a long exploration, and if you're still here with me now, I'm grateful for your company on this path through one of Westeros's most troubling tales. The story of House Frey is, in the end, a human story. A story about wanting to be valued, about the pain of exclusion, about the terrible choices people make when resentment grows too heavy to carry. We've seen how pragmatism can curdle into ruthlessness, how patience can fail at the crucial moment, how the very qualities that build success can destroy it if they're not balanced by something deeper, something better. But these are just stories now, voices from a world that exists only in imagination, and the Green Fork flows on whether we listen or not. The bridge stands or falls in dreams alone. Let it all drift away now. Let the Freys and their bridge and their choices fade like mist in morning light. You've travelled far tonight, through centuries and sorrows, and you've arrived exactly where you need to be. Here, safe, breathing slowly, ready for rest. Whatever burdens you carried into this night, you can set them down. The watch can wait. The bridge can stand without you. The world will turn while you sleep, and all the questions we've contemplated together can rest unanswered for a while. There's nothing you need to solve, nothing you need to understand, nothing you need to hold on to. Let the story go. Let the names and the places and the long years of Frey history slip away like water through your fingers. Let yourself settle, deeper and deeper, into the quiet darkness where sleep is waiting. The twins are silent now. The feast hall is empty. The river flows on in the night, and you can flow with it, can let yourself be carried by currents that ask nothing of you, that require no choice, no calculation, no effort at all. And now your watch has ended. Sleep well, dear friend. The realm can wait. Winter may be coming, but tonight there is only warmth and safety and the gentle drift toward dreams. The bridge endures or falls, the river flows or freezes, the old lord counts his grudges in the darkness, but none of it touches you here. You are safe, you are still, you are ready to let go. Good night.